Good morning, and I would like to welcome members, our witnesses, and those joining us online to the Economy, Energy and Fair Work Committee's 24th meeting of 2020. Now, I turn you to our agenda, and agenda item 1 is the decision on taking business private. So before I introduce today's witnesses, we'll consider agenda item 1, and that's to take items 3 and 4 in private. Do members agree to take items 3 and 4 in private? I'll allow a pause for any objections. Okay, thank you very much. So in that case, let's turn us to agenda item 2, which is consideration of the Tied Pubs Scotland Bill. And this is our main item of business this morning. And I'm pleased to welcome our first panel of witnesses. And so I would like to introduce Tom Steiner, the Chief Executive of CAMRA, Keir Greenaway, the Organiser of GMB Scotland, Jamie Delap, the Scotland Regional Director of the Society of Independent Brewers, Paul Waterston, the Scottish Licensed Trade Association, Greg Mulholland, the Campaign Director of the Campaign for Pubs, Chair of the British Pub Confederation, and Chris Wright, who is the head of the Pubs Advisory Service. Now, I must advise today that we are quite constrained for time. We have 2 busy panels and we're taking evidence from the Minister. So I have asked our witnesses and our members to keep their questions succinct and their answers succinct. Unfortunately, we did have to move some of the panels around, and I would apologise to our witnesses. I know there was an oversight in informing some of them, but we've had to do this in order to make sure that we get adequate evidence from everybody. So I'm going to move to questions from the members. I'm going to invite each member to ask their question, and then I'll go to the witness that the member has directed and allow, where possible, other witnesses to respond, and the member will get a chance to follow up on their question. I won't be able to ask every witness to respond to every question due to time constraints, but obviously if the witnesses want to indicate if they want to come in, I will do my best to make sure that they get the chance to contribute. So let's turn to the first question, and it's going to come from Alison Harris. Alison, please.
Good morning, panel. I would like to ask you about the existing voluntary code and whether you think this protects the rights of tied tenants. And I'm happy to take answers from whoever feels most strongly about this.
Okay, so who'd like to go? Any volunteers? Right, I'll start at the top of my list then. Tom Steiner, would you like to come in first?
Well, good morning and thanks for the opportunity to speak to you today. I think the important thing to understand is that the current system in Scotland is unregulated by legislation, and it does create an imbalance of power as the pub companies hold a monopoly over the supply and cost of the tied products. Now, you mentioned the fact there's a voluntary code, and our belief is that voluntary code simply isn't working. This was tried in England and Wales before the introduction of the Pubs Code and Adjudication in England and Wales. It ran for about 10 years. There were 6 different versions of voluntary code, and the English and Welsh government decided that it was necessary to bring in legislation to bring in a pub code and adjudicate it because that voluntary code wasn't working. It appears that the voluntary code still does not rebalance the relationship between licensees and tenants. The surveys that you've seen have shown that licensees in Scotland still believe that the government needs to act to ensure the protections that are currently enjoyed by licensees in England and Wales are also applied in Scotland, which would seem to be fair. 74% of respondents to a 2014 survey considered themselves worse off as a result of the tie, which again suggests that the voluntary code is not working. And over 90%, 96.5% in fact, respondents believe that paying reduced rent did not fully take into account the higher prices they have to pay for beer, which can be 50% more than on the open market. In relation to the maybe the lower rent that they pay on their businesses. So the experience in England and Wales has shown that voluntary codes don't seem to work. I think the same would apply here. You've got to remember the voluntary code is being administered by the same organisations that were administrating the voluntary code in England and Wales. and this is why we believe it's important for this legislation to be brought forward.
Okay, thank you. And I see Greg Mulholland would like to come in. Greg.
Yes, thank you, Convener. Thanks, Alison, for the question. And thanks very much for inviting me and all of us and fitting this important session in. Very simply, the voluntary code in Scotland, very much like the voluntary code in England and Wales, was devised very deliberately by the large pub companies and their trade association to appear to be doing something, to appear to be taking some action about some of the concerns expressed by committees in Westminster and committees and MSPs in Scotland. And of course, very cleverly and deliberately, the voluntary code doesn't deal with the fundamental problem. And I think it's useful to say at the outset of this session what the problem is. The problem is very simply that the large companies operate an unfair model where they take too much of the profit from a pub's profit, leaving the tenant, the small business, unable to make a living. And often we're talking about the large company taking 80–90% of profit, which is why so many tenants are on such a low income when a pub has a reasonable turnover and a reasonable profit. So of course no voluntary code does anything about that. Voluntary codes deliberately exclude any mechanisms to deal with that, which is why the market rent only option, the option for an independent rent assessment and then the right to take that assessment, is so crucial. And no voluntary code will include that. It'll be a question of rearranging the deck chairs, try to look like they're doing, but actually avoiding the fundamental problem. And that's why legislation was essential in England and Wales, even though sadly I can tell you firsthand it was botched, and we're looking to the Scottish Parliament to do it properly, to do it more cleanly and to do it effectively. But that's why legislation is absolutely essential in Scotland too, to give Scottish tenants that right to not be exploited, to take a fair share of the profit that they themselves make from their own pub.
Hey, thank you, Greg. See, Chris and Wright and Paul Waterston are also looking to get in. And as this is the introduction, I will allow you all to speak. So, Chris Wright, please.
Good morning, Chair. Thank you for letting me speak. Just wanted to say that the voluntary code that's been in operation has proven not to tackle important issues related to unfairness, especially risk and reward, which is one of the key planks of the bill that is in front of Parliament. The existing voluntary code cannot offer MRO to tenants, and in previous committees or sessions down in Parliament in Westminster, the BBPA said the profitability of tenants was not of any concern for BBPA members. There's also a point to make that it's not universally loved, self-regulation, and there's not often a very low take-up. I wanted to make this point that prior to the Groceries Code adjudicator coming into being, there was 0 complaints to the former self-regulation for Groceries Code, yet Scotland still approved the Groceries Code for suppliers. So we are looking for parity here. And I think that's an important point to make, that you have already agreed that there should be a Groceries Code, so I believe there should be parity for a pubs code. Thank you.
Thank you. And finally, Paul Waterston, please.
Yes, thanks very much. Just a point of detail here. The pub codes in Scotland is now governed by the pub's governing body. And as you probably know, the pub code was brought in July 2016. The SLTA knew nothing about the pub's governing body until we got an email in 2019 telling us that we were on the governing body. We knew nothing about it. And one of the problems we've had with this was that tenants didn't know procedures and the way the pub code worked, because people like ourselves didn't know anything about it, and we were actually on the panel. And it's easy to see why perhaps the pub code hasn't worked. So there was nothing done till October 2019, and the first meeting should have been in March or April of this year, but for obvious reasons it was cancelled.
Thank you. Thank you. Alison, do you want to follow up?
No, I'm quite happy with the responses we've heard, Convener. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Gordon Mcdonald wanted to come in. Gordon.
Thanks very much, Convener. Just a very quick question on the back of what Paul Watterson said about the voluntary code. It's concerning that you didn't find out about it till October 2019, and the first meeting hasn't taken place yet because of the pandemic. Therefore, has there actually been an opportunity for the code to be tested? Because I believe there's been no rent reviews under the code. And secondly, we've had 16 licensees write directly to the committee to give evidence, written evidence. 10 of them are against this bill. We asked of the 750 Tide pubs licensees to take part in a survey, of which 39 did. We asked 7 licensees to speak in front of a focus group last week, and only 3 turned up. If there is really a problem in Scotland, why we haven't heard from the licensees in Scotland?
Right.
Well, I think
anybody want to address? Mm-hmm.
It was for Paul.
Okay, Paul. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, I think we've tried to coordinate as much as we can, people responding to different things. The biggest problem that we have here is that tenants are genuinely concerned that they'll be victimised if they answer any of these questions, if they get involved at all, even if it's anonymously. So, there is this, because it's such an unfair system, that it's a terrible situation when tenants are talking to us and saying to us that they don't want to publicly say anything. And it's very difficult for them in the position that they're in. And then usually when they end up leaving the pub, we lose complete contact with them. So I don't think that's a good reason not to look upon the bill positively. We've seen what happened in England. We know that there's a problem here. We know that people don't want to get involved publicly. We get that all the time from them, and that's why there seems to be a dearth of complaint. Regarding the pub code, half the people we've spoke to, tenants, don't even know there is a pub code in Scotland. And as I go back to my previous point, if we didn't know that we were on the panel for it, and we were asked to go on it, what chance have tenants got? Pubs are very insular places. The world ends at the front door. People tend to get involved in their own businesses, and they tend not to look outside for help and so on. It's just part of the culture of pubs.
Thank you. I've got Chris Wright and Greg Mulholland both want to come in on this point, so I'll go to you quickly because I think it's quite an important issue. So, Chris.
Yes, thank you. I wanted to agree with what Paul Watson just said a minute ago, but I wanted to add a point. Are the 10 people that are against the bill actually Tide tenants? I saw an article in a Scottish feature a few months ago, and the person who was opposing the bill was not actually a Tide tenant that would be affected by the bill. They were in a joint venture with a pub company. They were somebody who was going to be outside of the legislation. So this wasn't even affecting them, yet they were obviously coming forward to say that they were against it, yet it had no bearing on their business model. So this proposal, this bill, is not there to stop people that want to enter into joint ventures, but I don't see why anyone that's in a joint venture would oppose it. It's got nothing to do with them. I also wanted to say that the other reason that most tenants have said to me that they don't come forward is that they fear having benefits taken away from them. We must remember that a lot of the so-called Tide benefits are operated on a whim by the regional managers and the BDMs. They are not in the lease. They can be taken away at the discretion of the pub company. It's a very key issue. So people fear having the little bit of support that they do have, which is not in their lease, removed from them for speaking out or attending a campaign or saying something on Twitter or social media. So I wanted to make that point as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Can I move to Greg Mulholland then?
Thanks, Convener. I mean, Gordon, I can absolutely understand why you asked that. I think one of the reasons we have found, and you'll be well aware as a committee, is that the last 4 months or so have been the most awful period for licensees in Scotland, England, Wales, and many other places. But it's been a desperate time, worrying about the closure of businesses, and in the case, of course, of the pubco tenants, having to pay rent through the COVID period. And one of the things that we've seen in England, to give you a sense of the discrimination against tenants who exercise their right in England and Wales, and this is something I hope the committee will bear in mind. In England and Wales, the successfully managed to get a market rent only lease, a free of tie lease, are being wholesale discriminated against by, including Star pubs and bars owned by Heineken, and you've got Lawson Mount Stevens on the next panel. You might wish to ask him. So tenants who've exercised their legal right to go onto a market rent only lease are being charged full rent through the entire COVID period. So that gives you a sense of why tenants are anxious and why they don't want to speak out. And in terms of the 10 people who wrote in the Westminster legislation, one of the large regulated pub companies put responses to its tenants, asking them to insert their details and then send in template responses saying how happy they were and how unnecessary legislation was. So is rife. And yes, there are far fewer Hyde pubs in Scotland. There are fewer pubs in Scotland as a whole. But I would put it to the committee, why should a tenant of Star Pubs and Bars or Green King or one of the other companies 2 miles north of the border between Scotland and England, no rights to go free of tie and no statutory protection compared to someone just the other side of the English border? So really, the same rights, because as tenants' submission very powerfully states, there are consequences of not having the same rights, and that puts Scottish tenants and indeed Scottish pubs in an unfair position. And I think that's something that I would hope that Scottish MSPs and the Scottish Parliament and indeed the Scottish Government would seek to rectify, to give Scottish tenants the same rights.
Okay, I see Tom Steiner is also trying to get in, though we're running over on this one, but obviously it's probably a key issue to what we're going to be talking about. So, Tom, do you want to come in?
Thank you very much. I'll try to be as brief as possible. I just again repeat the fact that, in our 2014 survey of 200 Thai tenants, 99% of those felt that the Scottish Government needed to act on this to afford the same protections to Scottish licensees as in England and Wales. And the Scottish Parliamentary Committee's own statistics found that 93% of tenants felt legislation was necessary in order to strengthen their hand in their relationship with their pub owning businesses. That 63% of those felt that this bill would improve the relationship between themselves and their pub owning business, and that 94% of them welcomed the right to request a market rent only provision in the bill, because they felt, again, that would improve their position in terms of the relationship between them and their pub owning business.
Thank you, Tom. Obviously, we have run over quite a lot on that, but I think that's probably set the scene as to why the members on this panel, the witnesses on this panel, feel that we need a bill. So I'm going to move to Colin Beattie now for question 2. Colin.
Thank you, Convener. I'd really like to look a little bit about investment into pubs. And the committee's heard that one impact of this bill might be that pub tenants actually increase their investment in the pubs they lease as a result of being able to negotiate a better deal with the pub owning company. Given that the tenant doesn't actually own the underlying asset, the pub, is there a risk that this investment would be rather limited and short term? And maybe I could ask Jamie Delat to...
Jamie, you want to come in then?
Yes, thank you. So firstly, thank you very much for inviting us to be a part of this forum to discuss this. So, I mean, broadly at SEBA, obviously we are suppliers, our members are suppliers into all of these pubs. Very few of our members actually operate any significant number of pubs at all. We would be cautious about this, that there is the potential on the investment question for unintended consequences here. There exists in the market, I think it's fair to say, two forms of tie. There is the property tied to beer, which is very much what this bill is discussing, but there is also very much another model out in the market which has investment and loans tied to beer. Now, from our perspective, we would like to see, in a perfect world, sort of property is property, finance and investment is investment, and beer is beer, and the three things should be considered separately as far as possible. However, I think it's fair to say that, clearly the market has got room for, there are many different funding models available in the market. There have been many different sources of investment available in the market, and one would hope that the market will adjust and find the right routes to put investment into the right pubs. But I think I would be cautious as to...
How is that going to happen?
Yeah. Again, I think that, as I said, we're not involved. Being totally honest about our limitations here, we do not run pubs. That's not an area that I think we have direct expertise. As we said in our evidence, it's not an area we have direct expertise as to where that investment would come from.
Well, I've got a number of witnesses wanting to speak on this who presumably can bring maybe some answers to it. So I've got Greg Mulholland, Tom Steiner and Chris White all wanting to come in. So we'll take Greg first.
Yeah, I mean, it's a key question, Colin, and it's one that the pub companies and their trade association, the Scottish BBPA, will always trot out as a reason why the tied model is of such value. But the simple reality of what they term investment is actually really just a form of a loan. Crucial to understand. And I have challenged pub company bosses themselves. And indeed, I've worked directly with tenants, as have some of the other witnesses here. And the reality is that if a pub company says, we will invest in your pub, then the person that actually pays for that investment over time is the tenant, is the lessee, because it is added on to their rent or the wet rent, the huge markup that tied tenants have to pay for beer. And there's also a myth here, because it's important to remember that there are plenty of tenants who are free of tie. There are smaller companies who operate free of tie tenancies. Indeed, some community pubs, some individuals who own pubs operate free of tie tenancies. And it's perfectly possible, it's equally possible to invest in pubs if it's on a free of tie basis. The issue is the pub successful? And pubs are generally more successful if they can offer what customers want. But what we've seen in terms of what's happened in England and Wales is where people have been freed, where they are paying a fairer rent and are no longer having to pay these hugely inflated beer prices, the licensee themselves can invest finally in their pub business with the confidence going forward, knowing that they will be able to make a living. Because in the end, when the licensee is struggling, is not making a living, that is the biggest factor actually that stops investment in pubs. And that's why pub company pubs over the years have been so underinvested in.
But Greg, if they don't actually own the asset and they're making significant investments into that asset, how does that work? Because the investment, surely they will limit that in terms of the lease that they've got outstanding. So there are certain risks involved in that.
Yeah, I mean, Colin, it's a model that balances risk and reward, or is supposed to balance risk and reward. And really that's the point. And that's the point of the Tied Pubs Bill. It's trying to get a better balance of what that risk is. And without going through the history of this, we moved in the whole of the well, Great Britain certainly, Northern Ireland has a different operating model, more similar to pubs in the Republic of Ireland. But UK pubs, UK Tide pubs, moved from short tenancies on brewery leases, where the brewery had a direct interest in selling beer and invested in the pub. And it was the beer orders that were botched and allowed the large pub companies to set up. They then moved tenants onto these 25-year fully repairing and insuring leases and put all the risk onto the pub companies. And if you speak to the likes of Greene King and Marston's, where they are hugely profitable, and indeed Star, where they're hugely profitable, they will have a manager and they will take all the profit. Where it's a more marginal site, they'll put a tenant in and the risk goes on to the tenant. But the problem is with their model, with the Tide model, it doesn't allow the licensee to make a fair living because of the huge amount they had to pay extra for beer. And I'm sure the committee have seen price lists comparing brewery prices, genuine free house prices, free of Tide prices with the Tide prices. You're talking about a huge markup on every single keg, which makes it very, very difficult to have a living. So if you're free from that, you can make a living. Licensees want to continue to operate. They want to have a good relationship. They want to continue running a pub, but they can only do so if they're making a living. And at the moment, the way the large companies operate the tie, it makes it impossible. So even if you get investment, actually tenants don't see the benefit because in too many cases they simply can't afford the amount of rent, and they throw back the keys and they have to move on. And we've got to stop that cycle because it's very damaging for pubs, for publicans, and then of course we see more pub closures.
Okay, I'm going to move to Tom Steiner. Tom wanted to come in.
Thank you very much.
Brief.
Yes, I'll do my best. To build on what Greg's just said and to give you some perspective, that survey we did of 200 Tide tenants, over 50%, 54% said their annual take-home earnings were between 10 and 15,000, and 10% of those respondents earned under 10,000. I think that gives some perspective on how little money is being made by these licensees and therefore how little money they have to invest in their business. I think it's important to remember that, like a lot of retail business where you rent the premises, make a business decision about investment. So yes, you might not own the actual bricks and mortar, but you invest in your business, and that doesn't necessarily have to be in the bricks and mortar itself. It can be in staff, it can be employing local people, it can be in offering a better service and therefore making your business more attractive to customers. So we believe that a Tide Pubs bill and a market rent only option would allow licensees the ability to sustainably invest in their business in the right way, increase their profits and reinvest money back into local economies. And the other side of that coin is that it will encourage the pub owning businesses to give great offerings to these licensees. So the people who do own the bricks and mortar pub owning businesses are going to have a very attractive offer to ensure that their licensees don't want to go MRO. And that means giving them the investment, giving them the support for their business and showing actually it is worth staying with us. And another statistic for you, that Scottish Parliamentary Committee that we had, 62% of licensees said they'd received no investment in the pubs they'd rented. Or if anything had been offered, it had been offered on terms, and as Greg mentioned, these kind of loan agreements were not acceptable to them. So at the moment, we're not getting the investment into the sector we need. And that's because of the low earnings, it's because of the inability to actually build successful businesses by licensees.
Okay. Thank you, Tom. Chris Wright.
Thank you. There's a number of points to make. I'll be as quick as I can. One of the so-called benefits of being tied is access to capital investment. Most pub companies, in fact the largest one in the United Kingdom, Enterprise Inns, EI Group, state that this is a benefit of being tied. As you can see, it's operated on a whim. Tom Steiner just pointed out that the vast majority of tenants do not get access to this, so it's not in the lease. Another crucial point, it's not a tied benefit you can rely upon. It is purely operated on a whim. There is no competition in lending. For example, high street banks and other independent sources of funding do not want to touch tied tenants. Yet as soon as a tenant goes free of tie, they have access to the market, the whole of the market. That is clearly a beautiful and lovely competitive situation that we would all desire in business. So tied tenants are left basically with one lender, and that is their landlord, who operate it on a whim at incredibly onerous rates. When I did a bit of a study into this some years ago, the capex, which was the investment which was added to the rent, worked out at 24% APR. Now that's payday lending rates. That's ridiculous. If you go to the free market in Scotland and seek to borrow money from someone like Tenants Caledonia as a free trader, you're probably looking at 4% above base. So a tied tenant is looking at rates of interest which are 7 times higher than what they could get in the free market. So it is a myth to say that pub companies invest. They invest at incredibly high rates which are not competitive and often weigh down the publican with far too much commitment, which they cannot resolve, and often they will decline and fail. So I just wanted to make that point that in the free trade, there is an awful lot of money lent out to free houses. In the tied trade, it's incredibly restrictive. And this bill does propose to rebalance risk and reward. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And finally on this question, Paul Waterston.
I think it's just worth illustrating the difference in prices in tied pubs and what tied pubs are paying. So for instance, just quickly, a keg of beer could be anywhere between £35 and £40 dearer for a tied tenant to buy from the pub owning company. So for every 1,000 kegs they sell, there's about £35,000 there floating about that they don't get. That goes directly to the pub owning company. If the pub owning company is a brewer, they have profits all the way down the line. So when we're talking about money and we're talking about investments, there's £35,000 taken straight from the tied tenant, which is totally unfair. It doesn't give them the same basis to work on as a free trade, and that's one of the things that this bill is trying to do.
Thank you. Right, I'm going to move on to the next question now. So I'm going to move to Richard Lyle, please.
Thank you, convener. My question is to Jamie Delap. The Society of Independent Brewers operate beer flex, which some tied tenants can utilise to stock local beers outside the beer tie. To what extent would the statutory guest beer right change the situation for tied pub tenants and small brewers, and is this necessary, Jamie?
I'm very small. You said, does the what adjust the timing?
Sorry, your mic was turned off there.
Yeah. Sorry, Richard, I just missed, you said, does the something affect the relationship? I couldn't quite hear what you said, Richard, I apologise.
Right, so to what extent would the statutory guest beer right change the situation for tied pub tenants and small brewers, and is this necessary?
Fantastic. So the situation that our members face, and it is quite varied. It would be different for someone that runs a larger brewery such as my own compared with many of our smaller members. But particularly looking across the trade, we would estimate that in excess of 90% of all the lines in Scotland, we are unable to make a commercial offer in order to be able to service those lines. So we face very restrictive competition. So where there is an independent small business running a bar, and this is really talking across the whole sector, in 90% of the cases, our members are unable to actually make a commercial offer in order to supply that line. Now, BeerFlex does provide an element of access. We would certainly acknowledge that, but it's relatively small. It's under 5% of all our members across the UK's sales, and in Scotland it's probably about half that, partially because there are far fewer tied pubs in Scotland than there are south of the border. So we would broadly welcome anything which enables fair competition to enable our members to make commercial offers to what are effectively independent businesses. But so yes, I think that particularly the proposal in the model for a guest beer option, as well as the market rent option, potentially makes it much more flexible for tenants to craft their offering in such a way that they can actually put on a range of beers and craft beer offer to suit the audience they have for their bar, the customers they have in their bar, rather than just having a fairly standard range of products, which would be the same in any English pub or any other pub up and down the high street.
Okay.
I hope that
Thank you,
helps.
Tom. We've got Greg and Chris both want to come in, so I'll take both of them and then I'll come back to you, Richard. Greg.
Thank you. I think Tom wanted to come in as well. I don't want to jump in front of Tom if Tom wants to come in first.
Sorry. I missed Tom. Did you want to come in first, Tom?
Very, very quickly, thank you very much, Greg. That's very kind of you. Actually, I will say that Johnny said just about everything I want to say. I would add it's important to bear in mind that when we're talking about guest beer rights, we're talking about draft beer. And we just need to be careful that this does properly support, Scotland has a great choice of brilliant breweries now, and we need to make sure it's draft beer, it's beer from local breweries, it's giving flexibility to licensees that they currently don't have access to, and allowing them to offer to customers the great beers that they would like to drink and enjoy.
Thank you. So back to Greg then. Your microphone's off, Greg. Hold on a sec. Will you put Greg's microphone on, please?
Is that better?
Yeah, you're on.
I haven't turned anything off.
No, you're fine. We can hear you now.
Okay, yeah, so I haven't touched anything, I promise. Good. I think it's important to realise that the market rent only option, which would give tenants the right to an independent assessment and then to go free of tie, that would be the best way of allowing the many, many wonderful brewers that there are in Scotland now. I had three very happy years in Scotland 20 years ago, and I've watched the wonderful proliferation of Scottish brewers and Scottish beer over that time. It's an absolute joy, and Jamie's is one of those breweries. And it's staggering when you think that 90% of the beer lines in Scotland are tied. And when you consider that the biggest beer brand in Scotland, Tennent's Lager, that many tenants now sit allowed to stock that their customers want, whether it's Tennent's Lager, whether it's one of Jamie's beers, Jarl, or one of the other beers, or some of the smaller micros, because people do want local choice. That is because of the dominance of the larger tied pubs. So I think a guest beer right would be welcome, but going back to something that Tom Steiner said earlier, in the end, if we rebalance the risk and reward and allow people to take a fair share, the pub companies themselves would be forced to come back with fairer offers if they really wanted people to stay tied. And they would then offer tied deals, part-tied deals, but you would see a better negotiating position for tenants, as well as that right to go free of tie. Because in the end, the best way to do it is to have more pubs able to buy direct from local breweries at fair prices, because that's better for the pubs and the publicans and the viability of pubs. But it also means that the pub companies, they are forced to sell very, very low, and then the pub company sells at a hugely inflated price. So in both cases, it's the small brewer and the publican losing out, being exploited by the big pub owning company.
Okay, and finally on this bit, Chris White.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to make the point, it was wonderful to hear a senior member of SEBA describing and calling out anti-competitive issues to the MSPs here today. This is clearly beyond the scope of this particular bill, but I did want to say I hope that members of this committee will make a call now for a competition inquiry into the wholesale beer market. We've not had one since 1989, and from what Jamie has just said, I think it's long overdue, and I hope the members of the committee will take what he said and push that forward, because clearly it's very needed. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Richard, anything you want to add?
No, for the sake of time, convener, I'm happy. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. Willie Coffey then. Willie.
Thanks very much, convener, and good morning to the panel. I just wanted to ask a couple of quick questions. The first one is something that's in the policy memorandum to the bill. There is a suggestion by a small number of respondents that the bill could actually lead to some pubs actually closing, and the member proposing the bill acknowledges that too. Do the panellists have a view in this, and is that a risk worth taking, that we introduce a bill that actually leads to pubs closing in Scotland?
Do you want to pick that up? Greg. We'll go Greg Mulholland, and then Chris, and then Paul. Greg, I hope you're on.
One of the things that we went through, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Willie. One of the things that we had to deal with was the consistent scaremongering by the British Beer and Pubs Association, the Pubco Trade Association, and the pub companies, that somehow this would be disastrous and would close pubs. Actually, it's nonsense, because the thing that so many pubs in Scotland and England and Wales, in terms of tied pubs, is the fact that the publican cannot make a living. And then you will see yourself those to let boards outside pubs where the tenant has failed, has moved on, and then a new tenant is sought. And that is very, very damaging. And it's that has led to so many pub closures. So actually, if you allowed the sitting tenant to make a fair living from the pub, which is surely what should happen in every case, to take a fair share of that profit, then you will have far fewer pub closures. The only threat really the pub codes have is that they sometimes say, well, if we can't make as much profit as we would like, then we'll shut the pub and sell it for alternative use, which is simply a threat. And actually, you need planning protection to deal with that. But the pubs are only sustainable when the publican who running the pub makes a fair living from the pub. So actually, this will mean far fewer temporary closures, and longer term, as we see more sustainable pubs able to deal direct, it will mean far fewer pub closures overall.
Okay, thank you, Greg. And we've obviously just turned off your camera so that we can keep your audio going well. So if I move to Chris.
Thank you. I wonder if Mr. Coffey could explain, when he uses the word closure, does he mean in the sense the pub is closed completely for alternative use, or does he just mean it's closed off for a tenant taking the pub and it is still a pub? I wonder if it could give me clarification.
Yeah, I've got the policy memorandum in front of me there, in paragraph 101. It actually refers to pub businesses actually closing, and the member proposing the bill acknowledging that this is a risk. So the idea of it just being a scaremongering issue has to be challenged, I think, and I'd appreciate your response to that.
Sure.
If you don't mind.
I think the word closure gets a little conflated between the two issues of the pub physically disappearing from the community as opposed to the pub being taken back by the owners. And often that's at the end of a lease under Section 25 of the Landlord and Tenant Act, called Grounds G, is taking the pub back for their own use. It's sad to say that's been a feature of the Landlord and Tenant Act since the 1950s, and obviously this bill is not aiming to reform that. But if it can be shown to be abused by landlords, I'm up for reform of the Act as well. But I suppose there is little to say other than if a property owner wants to take back a site and lose their own money with its own style of operation and manager, then they're at liberty to do so. I suppose the positive is at least the manager of a pub company running that pub will have a decent wage, income and rights, as opposed to an exploited tie tenant who's living off tax credits with no savings and no pension. So it will also cost pub companies huge amounts of money to take pubs back. They have to pay compensation, refurbish the pub, they'll lose wet rent and obviously the rent from the tenant. Then they'll have to cut out the staff, and there's all the hassle with recruitment and training, which has obviously been an issue in Scotland as well. So I do think it sometimes is a little bit overplayed, but I am aware that some sites are taken back by their landlords, but that is a separate piece of legislation and not one this particular bill is trying to reform. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Can I go to Paul, Jamie and Tom are all looking to get in on this as well. So we'll go to Paul first.
Yeah, regarding the comments of the author of the bill, he did go on to say after that that the bill would help to sustain or increase pub numbers. I think it's maybe taken a little bit out of context about the closures. And he also said that risk does not outweigh the need for action. And I would suggest that that's the really important part here. And to give tenants who are the most vulnerable because of the financial situation, to give them this opportunity of these protections, I think will free up. We've heard in so many ways already this morning how it will help them. And it certainly will help, I think, and increase the amount of pubs that are viable rather than end up closing pubs.
Thank you. So let's go to Jamie. Jamie.
Yeah, just to be brief. So our CBRA, our primary interest is in seeing a healthy, thriving pub sector. And that should be our guiding principle in all of this, particularly after these very challenging months that we've had during the COVID crisis. In many ways, we see the option, we see the most important word in the MRO as being the option. This is about providing information such that tenants and landlords are both share information and can clearly understand the benefits or not of taking the Tide model. We hope that that information leads to happier tenants and better landlords, and that the two coexist and thrive equally well. We're not arguing against the Tide per se. We're just hoping that this bill provides the opportunity for the government to put in place a structure which will assist the tenant-landlord relationship and actually improve it for the future. Okay,
and to Tom then.
Yeah, thanks to Paul who clearly spotted the same paragraph I had, which is paragraph 102. And as Paul says, it acknowledges there's potential risk, but believes that the bill could help sustain or increase pub numbers. And he goes on to say that his view is that pub-owning businesses' reaction to the bill is going to determine any likely pub closures, and that it's in their interest to ensure that their businesses are successful and the sector as healthy as possible. So I think there's maybe a little bit of selective quoting from this in terms of claiming it's going to lead to pub closures, and we don't believe that's going to be the case.
Thank you. Willie, do you want to come back?
Thanks very much, Michelle. I mean, it's a fair question to ask, I think, because it's in the policy memorandum, but I think the members in the panel have given some fairly thorough responses to that, Michelle. I wonder, given the previous conversation about the guest beers, is it possible to just ask the panel what's to stop the guest beer simply becoming another alternative high-volume lager? There's nothing in the bill that would seem to stop that. So if they don't answer it now, I wonder if they could maybe just keep it within their comments and answers to any of the other members. I'm happy to move on with that, Michelle.
Yeah, okay, thank you, Willie. So witnesses, if you've taken that question on board, you can pop it into your next answers if that's okay. So I'm going to move to Andy Whiteman, please. Andy.
Thank you very much indeed, Convener. This is to Greg Mulholland. Others can pick it up if they wish, but I think in your opening remarks, Greg, you said that you hope the Scottish legislation would be an improvement on the English and Welsh legislation. Obviously, that's been in place for some time now. We have some experience of that. Could you be more explicit about exactly the extent to which you think this bill improves on the English and Welsh legislation?
So, Greg.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. I mean, very briefly, yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes, you're fine. Go ahead, Greg.
Hello? Yeah, apologies, it must be a poor connection. Yeah, thanks for the question, Andy. Very briefly, I was directly involved in campaigning for and then in some of the discussions with ministers and civil servants around the legislation in England and Wales. I think it's really important to say that what was put onto the statute book was not actually what we campaigned for. It wasn't the simple, clear market rent only option that we called for. It was a fudge and a botch, I'm afraid. And then the English and Welsh Pubs Code overcomplicated the process, threw in the ability for pubcos to force arbitration for everything. So I think very simply, what I would recommend that the Scottish Parliament does is make sure that there's a simple market rent only option, which means the right to an independent rent assessment. And once that's triggered, the tenant must have the right to pay that rent and only that rent with no changes, no other changes to the lease, as they're not necessary, within a set period of time. The original suggestion in England and Wales was 90 days. Because at the moment what's happening in England and Wales, people are applying for the market rent only option. The pub company is either chucking in unreasonable terms, which leads the tenant to have to go to arbitration, or the level of rent set by the pub company also does that. And some of those arbitrations are going on for, over a year and a half, 2 years, which is a farce and is denying people their legal right. So I think actually there needs to be, in my opinion, some strengthening of the market rent only option on the face of this bill. And I've said that to Neil. I think there's a much cleaner, simpler way to achieve this. Having said that, I do think that it has learnt some of the lessons. Clearly, we've had problems in England and Wales with the adjudicator being someone who many tenants feel was not appropriate for the job, and indeed conflicted in terms of their interests, which I would hope that the Scottish legislation would avoid. So the legislation is better and simpler and gives a clearer right to tenants than the legislation in England and Wales. But I still think it needs further clarity on the market rent only option to ensure that it is a right, and it is a simple right. Going to Jamie's point, it should be the simple right to go free of tie on what would be the commercial free of tie rent on that pub in the current trading conditions versus a tied deal. And then the tied deal has to be attractive for people to want to take it. Otherwise, the legal right must be there. But it must be a legal right that can be taken within a set period of time, and it should not need any changes to the lease other than the rent changing and the tie. Because in England and Wales, pub companies are putting people onto shorter leases and putting in detrimental terms, such as insisting on people paying quarterly upfront and various other things, which wasn't supposed to happen in the legislation and has. So my simple message is Scotland can do this much better, much more cleanly, simply, and in the end that will give clarity to everybody. And in the end, longer term, that's in everybody's interest.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm just wondering if any panelists have a view, if this bill were to become law in broadly the way that it is framed, what is the future for the tied pub sector? There are only 750 in Scotland. We've heard that many tenants are earning very poor sums of money. I mean, is it your belief that if this bill were to be enacted, there would be a growth in tied pub arrangements, that it would remain relatively stable, or that the long-term future is bleak either way?
I've got Chris and Tom both wanting to come in, so I'll go with Chris and Tom first. So, Chris.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm just absorbing that second question. I think the improvement on the English and Welsh legislation, I probably speak from probably the most experience here. I've been involved in probably 40 different arbitrations in England and Wales, so I have exclusive first-hand knowledge of how the code in England and Wales doesn't work. The advantages for Scotland are quite clear to me. It introduces rebalancing risk and reward, which we don't have in the English code as a principle. And this is absolutely vital, really. What's happened in England, bless you. What's happened in England and Wales is there's been long drawn out arbitrations with endless appeals and cost threats to tenants. This is self-policing. This enables a tenant to simply opt to go free of tie. And if the tenant gets it wrong, then obviously they will go out of business and they'll hand the pub back to the pub company. It's self-policing. There's literally no cost to the Scottish government on this at all. And Tom Steiner had pointed out earlier that there was incredibly low earnings, which the honourable member has just made a comment about. Enterprise Inns, or EI Group as they're now called, they said in their own accounts that they were making £83,000 per pub in their tenanted estate, whereas the tenants are making about £17,000. This code is vital to rebalance that risk and reward. At the moment, the tenant is making 20% of what the pub company is making from the same pub. It's absolutely vital this bill goes through to rebalance that. That's the key difference, and that is why we need it in Scotland. Thank you.
So let's go to Tom then, and then Paul once in, and Greg.
Yeah, thanks, Mel. I think just to echo what Greg and Chris have both said, this is a chance for the Scottish Government to learn from the English and Welsh experience and to show, to do it better, to show how it can be done better. And for those reasons that have already been outlined, it's about speed of process, about clarity of process, it's about the right communication to licensees, and it's about giving the adjudicator teeth and ensuring that the adjudicator has that independence which gives licensees the confidence in the decisions taken and in the fact that they can go to this, sort out problems. I think to the second question, it's important to remember that the tied pub system is important because it gives very good licensees who maybe don't have the resources to buy a pub outright and go free trade to get access to the pub market and to run successful businesses. So our hope is that if you can rebalance the risk and reward, if you can make it a viable, sustainable business for someone, more people will be interested. Because I feel that at the moment people are put off because of the horror stories they hear about the way that licensees can be treated, how difficult it is to make money, the very convoluted contracts they have to enter into, and the restrictions that are placed on their own entrepreneurial ability to run what they can see as being successful pubs. So I'd hope if this legislation goes forward, if it's right, and I'm sure it will be, because you can learn from the experience of England and Wales, it will actually make it a much more vibrant market and a much more attractive business proposition for people looking to get into pub trade at an entry level.
Yeah, and Paul, we'll go to Paul, please.
Yeah, Tom's really said what I was going to say, that we've got to remember that the model here in its original form worked very well. It let people get into the business with low ingoings and so on. So there is a place. What we're trying to do here is make it viable. And as Tom rightly says, try and attract more people in, because people are being put off. And I think we've got the opportunity to look at the problems with the English situation, and definitely we can do that better and actually make tenancies a lot fairer on all sides.
Can I remind witnesses that we are quite tight for time? So if you're basically wanting to agree with the previous person, you can use the event chat as well, so you can put your comments in there rather than coming on. So Greg, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, thank you, convener. And very quickly, one of the exciting things, Andy, that we are seeing now in England and Wales, and this is partly the legislation and this is partly market forces, is we are seeing pubs that were previously owned by the large pub companies now being bought freehold by small entrepreneurial pub companies operating a very different model, not a tied model, often a managed model, sometimes a free of tie tenanted model. And we're seeing many of the new breweries actually buying pubs. There are two in my town that previously were pub company pubs that have just been bought by in one case a local restaurateur, in another case a local brewery, and they are now thriving. They've now had significant investment. So there's a real opportunity for the many entrepreneurs in Scotland, and because in Scotland there are fewer tied pubs anyway, there is a real opportunity for some of those pubs that have been struggling for years under the yoke of the pubco tie to be bought by more responsive owners, be they the small pub companies that are already existing in Scotland, be they entrepreneurs, or be they some of the fabulous Scottish breweries who are able to buy the freehold of a pub, invest in it and make it a wonderful pub again. So there are real opportunities going forward. And if the pub companies don't want them and don't want to invest in them themselves, then that would be the best future for those pubs.
Okay, thank you. And finally, can we go to Jamie?
Thank you. So we absolutely think that the Tide model is valid and it has its place in the market. So we very much hope that the purpose of this bill is more about improving the relationship between landlord and tenant and also helping that relationship to understand how they can put together an offer which reflects really what their customers want, and so looking to develop as varied an offering as possible. So we would hope that out of the end of this bill, we will not see a significant decline necessarily in the Tide tenancies, because I think it is, as was commented earlier, I think it is a valid route into the market for many potential tenants, to our understanding. So overall, we would hope that this leads to development in the market. I would just like to also briefly address Willie's previous question about the guest beer, because I think that's very important. I think that the wording of that clause, if it's to be included in the bill, will be incredibly important. If it just leads to another macro lager being offered on the bar, which being bought in at a cheaper price, all it will do is serve to devalue the value of the Tide tenancy and therefore alter the economics, but it won't actually enhance the offering. So we think that the quality of the way that phrase is worded is incredibly important. Otherwise, there are serious unintended consequences out there, which could be very damaging.
Thank you. Andy, are you content?
Thank you very much, Convener.
Yeah. Okay, in that case, can I move to Gordon Mcdonald, please? Gordon.
Thanks, Convener. Before I ask a couple of quick questions, I just want a bit of clarification from Jamie. Could you say, Jamie, how many Scottish brewers are members of Beerflex, and how many pub-owning businesses are members of Beerflex as well, just in Scotland, just so we get an understanding of the position?
I don't know exactly. So within SEBA in Scotland, SEBA has 60 members in Scotland, all of whom would be eligible to use Beerflex if they chose to. I think there are about 4 pub groups that use Beerflex in Scotland. From the top of my head, I'd have to get back to you with better numbers. It's only about 1,000 barrels a year of beer, which is sold through Beerflex into Scotland. So it's really not a huge feature of the market. I would say, though, that the pub companies such as Star and Green King, they do buy other SEBA members' beers through other routes, not just through Beerflex. So that would not by no means be the entirety of the supply into those estates. The only thing is that we have no idea, there is no method of influencing how well that works. It's a very tricky relationship for us to navigate commercially, and easier for a large brewer such as myself rather than many of our small members.
So a couple of quick questions. In England, the legislation only covers pubcos with a certain number of pubs, but there's no threshold in the Tide pub bills in front of us in Scotland. Now, given that of the pubcos that are operating in Scotland, 6 of the 10 have less than 50 pubs, should there be a threshold in this bill? And maybe hear from Paul Watterson.
Paul.
Yeah, well, we've always said that we don't think there should be any threshold on the pubs. People are running, if landlords are running their pubs properly, should have nothing to fear from the pub code, or the new bill. So no, there shouldn't be. Everybody should have the opportunity to be treated in a fair way, and if they think they're not being treated in a fair way, they should have recourse to somebody to try and sort that out for them. So no, there shouldn't be anything. I think it's really important that everybody that's tied in whatever way has recourse to it and is protected by this bill. And you know, as rightly said, it's a different framework up here. That threshold just wouldn't work up here as far as we're concerned. And again, I say that if people have nothing to fear from the way they're running their businesses and get nothing interfere from the bill.
Thank you. I see Greg wants to come in, so we'll go to Greg on that one.
Yeah, thank you, Gordon. I think it's important to point out that the reason for the limit in Scotland was because it was deliberately devised to exclude the medium-sized so-called family brewers who operate in England, and that was partly a political decision because of the influence that they have with politicians in Westminster. But I think the situation is very different in Scotland. But I think what's worth considering is the COVID crisis. The Campaign for Pubs actually are calling for the right for an independent rent assessment for all publicans, because we are seeing a situation where rents are being left in place for pubs of all types, and that's hugely damaging when their trade is down. So I think there's a real need actually for an independent rent assessment for many publicans, and actually for tenants, whether they are tied or free of tie, to have the right to see if their rent is a fair one on the basis of the current trading conditions, because there are many publicans struggling with trade hugely reduced compared to this time last year, really struggling, and yet it's all too easy for their pub owning company, for their landlord, or indeed a commercial landlord, to simply leave the rent as it was, and that's unsustainable. So with the very different marketplace in Scotland, we would argue that this right should be there for all pub tenants, tied or free of tie, to have that right to be paying a fair rent. And in the end, if it's a fair rent, then no one has anything to argue with. And if a tied model is fair and offers a considerably lower than that independent rent for the price of paying exorbitant high prices, then so be it. And that's a decision then that the licensee can take. But we think that all tenants need the right to a fair rent, so we would argue that this should apply to all.
Okay. Thank you, Greg. Gordon, you wanted to come back on that?
The only other thing I was going to ask was the running costs of the adjudicator and his salary is estimated to be about £375,000, which is not a great deal of money in the scheme of things. However, when you calculate it per pub, it works out at roughly £500 per tied pub in Scotland. Now, pubcos, like any business, will want to recover the costs, any additional costs that they incur from their customers. Is this actually going to make the tied pub rent situation worse, because these pubcos will try to recover the additional cost from their own customers because they've got no other option to get it other than from their customers?
I see Chris wants to come in on that, so we'll go to Chris.
Thank you. I think it's a very small price to pay, and we have to understand that I think what's being proposed in the detail later on is this a levy, quite correctly identified by Mr. Mcdonald, that the polluter will pay. And I think in the groceries code sector, based on the number of complaints that are received, the groceries code proportions the levy that they charge on the companies that have the most complaints. So there is a system of fairness rather than it being sort of prorated evenly amongst the number of pubs that they have. And I think that's quite a good system to be looking at. But also I think, it has to be acknowledged here by MSPs that the cost to this model going wrong falls upon the taxpayer in Scotland. When these people leave these pubs, they're often homeless, they have to be rehoused, they're often reliant on benefits, they've got no savings, they've got no pensions. If we can get this rebalancing risk and reward correct, they will not be falling back on the state for support when their pub deal goes wrong. So I think it's important to acknowledge that there is a cost that is being paid at the moment, and good legislation like this will avoid that cost to the taxpayers in Scotland. Thank you.
I see Tom and Gregor wanted to come on this. I've still got two members to come in with questions. So can I ask that you're very succinct? Thank you. Tom.
Yeah, thank you. As Chris said, you can ensure the legislation protects, either licensees from having to stump up the cost of this. It's right that it should be funded by pub-only companies. We feel that actually, because the number of tied pubs in Scotland is lower than England, the cost should not be as high in Scotland. It may be the adjudicator only needs to be a part-time position, which again will bring that cost burden down. And slightly cheekily, I'll suggest, if the voluntary code is working as well as people suggest it is, then we're going to have next to no complaints, surely, for the pub adjudicator to look at. As I said, that's a bit of a cheeky suggestion, but I think, it's a price worth paying, as Chris said. It's not a huge price, and you can ensure that the right people pay this.
Thank you. And Greg?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, very briefly, Gordon, the whole point of having the right to the market rent only option is to then have the right to an independent rent assessment and to pay that only to the pub owning company. And that mechanism is what will stop the current ability of the pub owning company to dump any cost onto the tenant, which is what currently happens. So that is the mechanism that will stop them being able to do that, because the independent rent assessment will give the market rent that then the tenant has the legal right to pay. And then the second quick point is the reason it's so important in this bill to get this right, to get the market rent only option right, and make it that simple right to an independent rent assessment, and then to pay that rent assessment within a set period of time, we recommend as 90 days. What that does is that avoids the absolute administrative chaos that there is in England and Wales, with years of unnecessary arbitration and thousands of pounds of cost for tenant, for pub company, and of course then for the adjudicator's office. You get the market rent only option right, allow people to take it without the pub company getting in the way of that in a set period of time. You cut down the work of the adjudicator and the adjudicator's office hugely, and that will keep the costs down.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to move to Rhoda Grant now. Rhoda.
Thank you, Convener. Just some quick questions on market rent only. The market rent only plus an independent rent assessment deals with rent and deals with inflated beer prices. What it doesn't deal with is return on investment, and we've heard this morning that can be up to 24% APR, which could be crippling if you're paying a market rent and have to pay that return on investment if that's already outstanding. And also some of the companies are saying they provide things like professional and business advice that wouldn't be available under a market owned rent. So I'd be keen to hear views either from or from both Chris Wright or Greg Mulholland on that.
Okay, so Greg's looking to come in. Greg?
Yeah, thanks, Rhoda. I think this really cuts to the heart of the whole issue, and indeed the whole lie that's peddled by those who favour this particular model. And I make it clear, I'm not talking about the tie necessarily per se, but the way it's currently operated by the large companies, which is exploitative. We've already dealt with the investment point, so actually tenants are freer to invest if they can make a fair living from their own pub. And that is the whole basis of the market rent only option. And the point, as I say, is a simple one. If the market rent only option is available, it gives the right for an independent rent assessment to then establish whether it's better to be tied on the current terms or to go free of tie. But I think what's a complete myth that's peddled is that somehow, if there's a pub company owned pub on a free of tie basis, that suddenly the pub company has no interest in it. That is a complete myth. There are pub companies who operate free of tie tenancies, and they still have business development managers. They still offer the same professional support. The idea that that professional support should only be available and is only available if you're forced to pay exorbitant prices for beer is a complete nonsense. It's perfectly sustainable, and there are pubs in England and Wales operated on free of tithe tenancies where they do get support from the pub owner. And indeed, it's also a myth to say that it's a low-cost entry only if it's tithe. Tenancies are a low-cost entry to the market, regardless of whether they're on a tithe tenancy or a free of tithe tenancy. It's still a tenancy, you're still paying a rent. The difference is, are you paying simply a dry rent to your pub owning company, or are you paying a dry rent and then a wet rent through the marked up prices you have to pay for product? And that is the discussion to be had here. But there's no reason you shouldn't get support and that you shouldn't get investment. That's a threat that the pub companies hold. But they give the impression that somehow, if a Star Bar and pub goes free of tithe, that suddenly they don't have an interest. They still take a rent. They still make considerable amounts of profit from the pub. So frankly, they should still support the tenant in doing so. So I think it is important to debunk that myth. But in the end, all this is about is having the opportunity to a fair independent rent assessment to then be able to make the decision as to whether to be tithe or to go free of tithe.
Okay, I've got Chris and Tom. Is there anything different that you want to add to that?
Yes, I just wanted to make the point about the business advice, the upfront business advice that pub companies promote. It's often gerrymandered. There's a panel of accountants and business planners that is pre-selected by the pub companies. And to give you a live example, a very experienced operator I know in Newcastle presented 3 business plans from their own advisor to the pub company. All 3 were rejected. When he asked why, they basically said, you need to use our panel guy. So they went to the pub company approved panel guy. He produced the business plan, which was then accepted. I looked at the 4 business plans. There was nothing wrong with the first 3. They were realistic. They were totally appropriate. And the 4th plan was unsustainable. It was unreliable and unsustainable. And it's awful. I see a lot of these projections and business plans, and they're not fit for purpose. Suffice to say, I think ongoing problem for tenants is that RIC surveyors who are specialists in this area of renting pubs and setting the profit and loss, they need regulating. I've seen so much evidence of absolutely unsustainable rents and projections and gross profits within drink and food that the publican can never make any money. So that sector, but this bill is not trying to fix that issue, but I do agree that the upfront business information is critical, that is something that the regulator is looking at and investigating and ruling on, because it is often a gateway to which a deal is ruined. So thank you.
Okay, and Tom?
Yeah, just quickly, on the 29% APR that was mentioned about investment was in reference to when licensees are unable to access any other money for investment due to the fact the way the tithe system currently works, it does, and this bill could fix it. The second thing is, in terms of support for licensees, as we've heard already, it will encourage the pub owning businesses to be much more competitive in the package they're offering licensees, because if they want them to stay tied in the traditional sense, they're going to have to make it absolutely worth the while the licensee, who's going to then have the choice to weigh up his business decision, his strategy between staying tied or going market rent only. So it puts the onus on pub companies to actually deliver a real quality experience to licensees to convince them that staying tied is the way to go.
Okay, thank you. Rhoda, are you content with those answers?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. In that case, I'm going to move to Maurice Golden, who's our last member to ask questions. And Maurice, can I just check, have you previously declared any interest to the committee?
Yes.
Yeah, that's fine then. Okay, you want to go ahead with your question? Thank you.
Thank you, convener. I've got several questions which I'll just do all in one go in the interest of time, but most of them would only require a one-word answer, which I'm sure you'll be delighted to hear. First of all, for Paul Watterson, you mentioned that the reason why there wasn't evidence from tithe pub managers were because they were frightened to come forward. I just would like to clarify whether there's any evidence of this. And if there is, then we'd like to get that on record. For Tom Steiner, you mentioned a failure in the voluntary code. Do you make an assessment there's been enough time in which to come to that judgment? And secondly, for Tom, you mentioned the 2014 survey. Do you think that the market and economic conditions are exactly the same now as in 2014 in order to make that assessment on the survey? And then for any of the panel, would the panel prefer commercial bank loans provide investment rather than pub companies regulated by a voluntary code? And final question to any members of the panel, is the pub market in Scotland exactly the same as England and Wales?
Okay, so Paul, the first bit was directed to you. I think it was a yes or no. So Paul, yes or no?
Anecdotal evidence, very, very much so. It's been going on for years that people just will not put their head above the parapet. They just feel that they'll be victimised, and we've heard that their leases can change and they're put under great pressure. And we're seeing that a lot in England at the moment, as Greg rightly said.
Okay, right. And there were a number of questions in Maurice's list. So does anybody want to come forward and address any of them?
I think answer, and then people can come in behind, possibly. I think Maurice asked whether there was enough time for the voluntary code to be assessed. I'd say yes, because you don't just have to view the experience in Scotland. You can take a decade of experience of voluntary code in England and Wales as well, which we would assert was proven to be unsuccessful, which is why there's a need for the pubs code in England and Wales. The question was also, do we think anything's changed since the 2014 survey? If you'd asked me this 3-4 months ago, I'd have said no, we think the situation is very similar. We see no reason why attitudes would have changed. However, obviously, we've had COVID since then, which has massively impact on licensees and the fortunes of pubs, as you'd expect. And sadly, I think any changes to circumstances of licensees is likely to be more negative, which again, I think stresses the need for this legislation to be brought in to really help them recover and bounce back and have as good a chance of running viable businesses as possible over the next few years.
Okay, thank you, Tom. And I've got Jamie and then Greg and then Chris. And then we will have to wind up because we're already over time. But I am going to just finish off by going to Keir at the end, who's managed to remain silent during all this. So I thought I'd give you the last word. So we'll go to Jamie first, please.
So yes, one of the questions there was whether there are differences between the Scottish and the English market, and I think we would say clearly we recognise that I think that the statistics are clear that there are far less tied as far as property tenancies in Scotland, whereas it's much more prevalent the model where there is a tie between investment loans and supply of beer. So there are very much two different models out there, both of which we regard as sort of restricting access for many of our members. But there's a definite distinction between the market. And that leads on to the question of would we prefer to see a vibrant business lending market, which was distinct from beer, available to the pub trade? And yes, absolutely, that would be our sort of very much our preferred thing. As we said, we don't believe that fundamentally we would like to be able to compete with other brewers on the basis of our beers, our offering, our commercials, and what that does for that pub's individual distinctive offering on the high street, in the village, wherever they are. So we definitely think that all things should be separate. Investment is investment, property is property, beer is beer, and we would love to see a much more vibrant financing market for the pub trade. To be honest, in the same way that there is for the restaurant trade. Restaurants manage to invest a lot of money in their premises and grow and develop thriving businesses. We're sure the pubs can too, with independent sources of finance which are clearly priced.
Thank you, Jamie. Greg, your last input.
Thanks, Kavita. And Maurice, two good questions, two quick questions and two quick answers. First of all, in terms of would tenants, and it's in the end it should be tenants making the decision, would pub tenants rather take a commercial bank loan or take investment from their pub owning company, the vast majority would like the opportunity to choose and to compare. And the reality is, in many cases, a commercial bank loan would be on better terms in reality than the current so-called investment being offered by the pub companies. But that may change if people then had the option to go market rent only. But in the end, our view very strongly is let tenants, they're the entrepreneurs, they're the people running the businesses, let them have that flexibility, let unlock that sense of entrepreneurship that you see in the free trade in Scotland and allow our pubco tenants to do it. Second question, is the Scottish market the same? No, absolutely, it's very different. There's actually already more freedom in Scotland than there is in England and Wales because thankfully you don't have so many pubs owned by the large companies. So it is different, but at the moment we still have a situation where those 750 tenants don't have the same rights as their English counterparts, and that is unfair. That is something that can't be allowed to continue. It doesn't allow them to deal directly with Scottish brewers, and that disadvantages the entrepreneurial Scottish brewers as well. So although it's a smaller number, those tenants still deserve the same rights. Scottish tenants still deserve the same rights and the same opportunities as their counterparts in England and Wales.
Thank you. And finally, Chris, please.
Thank you. Exploitation of small business owners has no border. Heineken was under investigation for allegedly misleading publicans on how much profit they make selling beer. Edinburgh City Council Trading Standards investigated Star Pubs and Bars months ago after being alerted to online adverts which had showed false turnover figures related to car scale in the leasing agreement. Heineken, as a result of this investigation, changed its adverts. This is clear acknowledgement of wrongdoing, and they also remain under a statutory investigation in England and Wales. I wanted to bring up the MSP's point there about the voluntary code, and he said it was enforceable, but it has no statutory force. It's operated on a whim. And as Mr. Waterston had explained, that he had not been told about how it was operating years after it apparently he had been on the panel. The statutory code does not rebalance risk and reward. The difference is, in Scotland, you can do something tangible instead of upholding the status quo, because all the status quo has done in Scotland has delivered huge information asymmetry, low rewards, and a poor consumer experience. So it is the chance to do something different, and I recommend that the members do support it. Thank you.
And for the final comment, I'm going to just go over to Keir Greenaway, who's been with us as a witness, but has managed to not speak so far. So Keir, you've heard everything. Have you got anything to add from the GMB's point of view?
Yeah, thank you, convener. I think some of the other witnesses were better placed for some of those questions, but I think from our perspective, we see the legislation as increasing volume for Scottish brewers in Scottish pubs, which will benefit Scottish workers. And that, I mean, we've got a main presence within Tenants Caledonian that would see more of their volume going into Scottish pubs, and that's what Scottish consumers want. We see the legislation as redressing a power imbalance, and we don't think responsible landlords have anything to fear from statutory legislation.
Okay, nice and succinct. Thank you very much, Keir. So that completes our questions and concludes our evidence session with the first panel. We have run over slightly, but I hope you all feel you had an adequate chance to put your point of view. So can I thank Tom, Keir, Jamie, Paul, Greg and Chris for taking part in this meeting. And we'll now take a very brief suspension. I think if we can just keep it to a couple of minutes. So if you could let me know if you're going away from your keyboard and let me know when you're back, and we'll try and get started in a couple of minutes. Thank you. Okay, and welcome back to continuation of our public section of the meeting. And I'm now pleased to welcome our second panel of witnesses on the Tide Pubs Scotland Bill. So can I welcome Lawson Mount Stevens, the Managing Director of Star Pubs and Bars, Emma McClarkin, the CEO of the British Beer and Pub Association, and Edith Monfries, the Chief Operating Officer for Hawthorne Leisure. Welcome everybody. As before, we're going to move to questions from members, and if you have anything that you want to add, you can put it in the event chat where we will all read it. So can I begin by moving to our first question from Alison Harris. Alison, please.
Good morning, panel. Let's get the correct question, sorry. Right. I ask how the creation of the Pubs Code in England and Wales has affected levels of investments in Tide pubs. And if I could maybe direct that firstly to Lawson Mount Stevens.
Lawson. Can we find Lawson, please? Lawson, can you hear us all right? I think while we're trying to find Lawson, perhaps we could go to Emma. Emma McClarkin. Let's go to Emma while we're struggling to find Lawson.
Good morning, convener, and good morning to the committee members. From a bright, I will say, a bright if not sunny Glasgow this morning. If I could just step in on that question while we find Lawson, I think that actually what we've seen is more investment coming up to Scotland as a result of what has happened with that legislation in England and Wales, because it puts at risk that investment. So actually we've seen probably more money coming into the Scottish pub sector, and that is what is at risk in the shadow of this proposal. We already know that £10 million worth of investment has been held back in Scotland whilst waiting what happens with this proposal. And I really hope that it will be proven today in our session, in our panel, that really there is no case for this statutory code. There is no evidence, as we've seen. The government's own economic study said that actually no part of the pub sector was at a disadvantage, and therefore you need to base this off of evidence. The evidence is that more investment is coming to Scotland, more would be at risk if a code came into play here as well. Do we have Lawson now, or shall I keep going?
No, keep going, Emma. If you've got more to say, otherwise we'll try and find him.
Very much so. I really wanted to just take a moment just to really paint the picture of how we see the partnership, which has been absolutely critical to the survival of pubs, particularly through this COVID crisis and the pandemic, where we have seen an absolutely devastated beer and pub sector in Scotland due to them having to be closed for 4 months. And many of those pubs only surviving with the support of that pub partnership. And it is very much what is sustaining them through this, with the discounts that they've given, with rent concessions that they've also given away to the tune of millions. And I think that is proving the strength of this partnership. It is something that is very strong. It is something in mutual benefit to see the success of that business coming together. And it allows people to know that their businesses are future-proof. I was in the Thornwood Bar in the West End here in Glasgow yesterday, and the landlord there, Mark, was saying, the deal that I have, the Tide partnership that I have, future-proofs this pub's future. This support that I get helps this pub remain here, helps me keep this going through this crisis. And the level of investment put in there was over 300,000. It's a beautiful bar. It's bringing back a whole area of the West End. And it is phenomenal to see that. And that is what you put at risk. And, there's an investment of £15 million a year coming in. And this is real investment that is giving the consumers what they really want, which is ultimately how we have a successful and vibrant and thriving pub sector, is by giving the consumers what they want. So very much, I do not feel that there is a strong case for this. There's certainly no evidence for this. The actual survey only was 7.8% of respondents from the sector. And then, of course, we only saw 37 of 750 pubs feeling that there needed to be some action. That is a very small percentage of people to be dealing with and creating a whole system, a whole code, just to deal with what could potentially only be 11 cases a year. And I really strongly feel actually that the voluntary code that we have in Scotland can deal with that. And we have now the governing, the Scottish pubs governing body, and that can deal with those cases. And there are other resources with PERS that looks at that independent review for pubs, but also with PCAS in that arbitration taking place in Scotland, that we have things in place. We have a procedure in place and code in place that would deal with that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Emma. Shall we go to Edith and then we'll come to Lawson? Alison, if you could just pop a question in the event chat so that Lawson can catch up on what he missed. Emma.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Edith, I mean.
Thank you very much, and I also would like to thank the committee for enabling me to join this morning and to speak on behalf of Hawthorn and pub owning companies to explain why the bill for us makes such a threat to our potential future in Scotland. And speaking very much to Alison's question about investment. In investment, you need certainty of outcome. And if the bill is introduced, and indeed for the length of time that there is the shadow of the bill upon us, we can't have any certainty about the future of our potential investments in Scotland. And for that reason, we would have to seriously consider what we are doing regarding our investment. Prior to the shadow of the bill, we intended as a pub company to invest about £2 million in Scotland. Now, clearly that has been reconsidered for two reasons. One is the shadow of this bill. The other reason is obviously the terrible events of COVID. And I think COVID, of all the circumstances, is so bad in many ways, but it's an illustration that the relationship between the pub owning companies and their tenants is not exploitative, as you would have been led to believe previously. It is very much a partnership model. It is in our interests to ensure that all our tenants open and open safely. And in fact, of our 96 pubs in Scotland, nearly all of them are open. I think we only have 5 closed pubs in the whole of our Scottish estate. Many of our tenants have welcomed the support that we have given them. None of our tenants are paying rent for July and August. In order for us to enable them to get back on their feet, we've put over £1 million of support into our Tide model. That doesn't sound to me like an exploitative model. And I believe that we offer excellent entrepreneurial opportunities. And it isn't an onerous relationship. It is a consultative partnership relationship in the mutual best interests of both the tenants and indeed the pub owning companies. We want to make a profit, but for us to make a profit, it's essential that our tenants make a profit and that the relationship is sustainable and long term. And we invest in that, and we invest in the future of those businesses, enabling men and women in Scotland to start a business in a position which they couldn't otherwise do. We have a bar in Dunfermline, and I was talking to Andrew yesterday. We invested 100,000 in February in this bar. It's a CAMRA award-winning pub, so it has quite a lot of choice. And in fact, it stocks some of the beers of Jamie Delap. It has a fine beer on its taps. It has 6 different taps with different craft beers, which I think illustrates that there is choice in the Tide model. And we put the product range behind the bar on the basis of consultation with our partners, the tenants. Our mantra within Hawthorn is putting people first, and that is the people within our organisation that we seek to protect through these difficult times, and indeed our tenants whom we seek to protect in these difficult times. That's the relationship we welcome and we foster. We welcome the voluntary code. All of our tenants are fully aware of it, as indeed are all of the tenants of all of the pub owning companies, because that information is provided to them.
Okay, thank you, Edith. And I think we now have Lawson back. So can we go to Lawson, please?
Yeah, I'll just read the question. The question again, Lawson, is: has the creation of the pubs code in England and Wales affected levels of investments in Tide pubs? I can't hear Lawson, sorry.
Hang on, Lawson, your microphone isn't on, I don't think. So can we just check? Just check that your microphone on the top right-hand corner is white. Hang on a minute. We seem to have silence again. Broadcasting, can we just check? No, I'm afraid, Lawson, we don't seem to be receiving any audio from you. We can see you now, but we can't hear you. So,
can't hear you, sorry.
Try again. No, I'm afraid, Lawson, we can't hear you. So we're going to have to move on, but I will come back and try you later. So, Alison, did you want to come back on any of that?
No, thank you. I think the other two panellists stepped in nicely and gave comprehensive answers. Thank you.
Okay, in that case, I'll move on to Richard Lyle, please. Richard.
Thank you, Convener. Can I ask, the market rent only lease has been highlighted as a source of uncertainty, which would result in reduced investment in the Scottish pub estate. As the underlying asset, the pub, would still be owned by the pub owning company, is there not still a value in investing to improve the quality of this and drive up the value of the market rent? I think that would go to Emma.
Emma.
First of all.
Good morning, Richard. What we've seen with the market rent only when it's being activated, within the first year actually of the statutory code coming in England and Wales, were that we had 17 of those in the first year. But we actually saw the number of tenant in the lease pubs reduced by 161. And this is what happens, is that the creation then happens of managed houses. And so we saw an increase of that of 150. So because, of course, the pub owning companies put a lot on the line in terms of these relationships, and there's no guarantee, therefore, that they'll get the return on that investment coming back in. So many of them then switch to a managed relationship. And that is what could happen in Scotland. We don't have as many managed houses in Scotland. In fact, there is already many independent free trade pubs in Scotland. It's a very different marketplace. And so this is not really a solution that's necessary this time. In fact, this proposal is not providing solutions for any problems at all. In fact, it's creating more uncertainty for the market at this moment in time. And particularly with the pandemic and the recovery that's needed, we really don't need that any more uncertainty being brought in.
Just going to try Lawson again. Can we just see if Lawson's there? Lawson? Still don't seem to have any sound from you, Lawson. Very unfortunate. Still no audio. No. Okay.
Convener, can I ask
yes?
Possibly Emma and Edith a supplementary?
Yes, go ahead, Richard.
It has been put, ladies, it's been put to me that because of the pandemic, most pubs, the beers weren't being sold, they were closed for a number of months, so they had to sadly dump beer and were restocked by their brewer or their whoever they were either tied to or the tenants, which saved the actual tenants of the tied pub a lot of money. Would you agree with that comment? Is that the case? Do you know what happened to when pubs reopened?
Right, I'll go to Edith first. Edith.
Yes, I do. It was a massive piece of work that we coordinated on behalf of all our tenants, which was the destruction of beer, which is actually quite a complex process. You can't just chuck it down the drains. I think actually over our whole estate, we assisted our tenants to destroy 700,000 gallons of beer, which for any beer drinking colleagues amongst you would be painful to hear. Because of our relationship with the brewers, we were able to ensure that destruction happened safely in an environmentally friendly way, which is extremely important, obviously, and also to ensure that the credits have been applied to the tenants so they're not out of pocket for any of the kegs that they had to destroy. And so that's worked really well. We've equally had to work very hard with the brewery companies to ensure supply back into our pubs to enable them to open with, beer on the taps ready to go. We worked literally night and day to ensure that happened with our distribution partners, C&C in Scotland, to ensure that that was the case. There is quite a lot of challenge still amongst Cal Scales and amongst the smaller independent breweries, but we are still working very hard to ensure that we have what we need on the taps to fill customer demand so that our customers have their favourite beer. And I think that's still the case. I think we're managing to achieve that, which is a great result. And we're really, really proud of that.
Thank you, Edith.
So at the end of the day, that...
Go on, Richard.
Sorry, Richard. Sorry.
Sorry, convener. Just supplementary to my supplementary. So at the end of the day, being tied to a brewer actually helped. Yes or no?
Well, I think absolutely yes. And I think particularly during these really challenging times, it's not just the help that we've been able to give around the beer and around the rent, but it's also the constant advice we've been able to provide. Obviously, this has been a fast-changing environment, and the regulations that have come from the government in terms of how we can open safely, what needs to be done, have got to have been really reactive to the situation we find ourselves in. We've been on the phones to our pubs. We've been issuing guidance, signage, PPE, and enabling everybody to open, which is why all our pubs opened on the first weekend. All our BDMs in Scotland were out throughout the weekend. We visited all our pubs. We spent hours on the phone. We spent hours on the phone throughout lockdown, supporting them, enabling them to apply for the government grants, enabling them to understand the complexities of the furlough arrangements, to ensure that they looked after their staff and made sure that people didn't suffer more than was unavoidable in these terrible times.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm just going to move and try Lawson again and see if we can get some sound. So Lawson. No, we still can't hear you, I'm afraid. Have you tried your slider just to make sure your volume's up? Okay. Afraid that's still not working. Emma, did you want to add anything to what was just being said?
Absolutely, and I would just say that it was a Herculean task having to make sure that we could dispose of the 70 million pints that we had that had to be environmentally disposed of safely, and it was a Herculean task to get that back. And I think actually it again shows the strengths of the Tide relationship. Because of that, they were able to get that credit note put back onto their accounts. We created actually a platform with the Scottish Beer and Pub Association, returnyourbeer.com, to make it easier for our tenants in order to log up all the beer that they were disposing of, to make sure that was there. And through that collaboration, you get that support. And that is the support upon which this model is based. So you're receiving a lower rent through this, plus that business support, and plus that arrangement that we have that means that you'll get access to investment, which is so critical, and at no more critical a time than right now.
Thank you. Right, can I move to coffee, please?
Ms. Convener, good morning to this panel. Maybe we could ask Lawson some questions and he could hold up some yes/no cards to answer the question. That might be helpful.
I think it's probably just worth saying, Willie, actually, and for you, Lawson, if you're listening, obviously the event chat button is there. So while we can't hear you at the moment, if you want to put comments into the event chat button, the members will see that and be able to pick it up and respond. Okay, sorry, Willie, go ahead.
Right, thanks. I just wanted to ask the question asked the first panel. It possibly touched a little on there. In the policy memorandum that we have on the bill, there is a question what the bill could lead to pub closures, and while that was acknowledged by the member, in fairness, he did say that the advantage of the bill would outweigh that risk. I just wanted to get the panels whom we can hear from what their views on that are and what justification they think there is for it. So both to Emma and Edith.
Right, Emma, do you want to go first?
Happy to. Thank you for the question, Willie. It is really, really worrying how many pubs were actually closing before this crisis, but given that the crisis is happening now, we're expecting many more. Can I just say that on the facts right now, twice as many free and independent traded pubs will close or have closed than those that are leased and tenanted under a tie. That is just a fact. You cannot dispute that. So you're putting that at risk in this very moment in time where pubs are already under an extreme amount of pressure. And when we see pubs close, they do very often close for good, and we don't want to see that happen. So the relationship can sustain that. And that's why I mentioned the comment from the landlord yesterday at Thornwood, because, you know, it future-proofs my pub. It future-proofs my business by having this arrangement, having that level of support there. So that is the real concern to me. And closed pubs do not contribute jobs to the community. They do not contribute anything to the economy. And the reality is that they're also losing that social value. So that is not a price that I want to see being paid anywhere in Scotland. And we're doing everything as a Scottish Beer and Pub Association to make sure that we support as many of those pubs through this crisis.
Thank you. Edith.
I really just wanted to reinforce that comment to say that we understand that in the face of this crisis, this is a long game. And the advantage to our tied tenants particularly is that we can afford to play the long game with them. We're delighted actually at the buoyancy of the way that they have returned and are trading now that they've reopened. But we also recognise the rocky road potentially that lies ahead, and that there may be tougher times. And so we have committed as a business to continue to support our tenants through this crisis, however long it takes, because we're in a position to do that. If you're a small independent operator, you don't have the wherewithal. It's harder to play a longer game. And if you are more reliant on external lenders with more onerous repayment arrangements, we don't make loans to our businesses. We work in partnership with them so that they succeed going into the future, and we will stick with them through this crisis. And if we need to give them more rent support, we will. If we need to support them with more PPE and more advice, we will continue to do so throughout this crisis. That's what we can do for our tenants because we're in partnership with them. If they succeed and they don't have to close their pubs, then our pubs remain open, and that is in our mutual best interest, which is the whole point of the tied arrangement. It's a mutuality of interest. It's an entrepreneurial and partnership arrangement, and that's why we see no need, particularly in Scotland, where only 17% of the market is tied in the first place. So people have choice. They don't have to enter a tied relationship. They could choose from the 83% of the market that is not tied if they felt that that was the better thing to do. But Andrew, one of my tenants, said to me yesterday, he said, I've worked in my bar for 17 years. I could never have taken this on if it weren't for this arrangement. And yes, I pay a wee bit more for my beer, but you know what? It's completely fair. It's completely transparent. I understand how it all works, and I couldn't have managed without the support of my BDM.
Okay, and I see Emma would like to come back in briefly on that. So Emma.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention about the pub closures and the pressures that were on the industry before this crisis. And really, when you look at the number of the free trade pubs that are closing and at greater volume, there are other pressures coming in rather than it being something problematic with the pub type model. There are other pressures that need more urgent attention. If I'm completely honest, those, the VAT, the taxation, the high tax burden we pay 11 times more beer duty than they do in Germany, and our business rates are astronomical and disproportionate for the beer sector and the beer and pub sector when they're paying them as well. So the reality is there are many other priorities that are pressures on business if we want to stop them from closure that we could focus on rather than this proposal.
Okay. Willie, did you want to come back?
I was just wondering if Lawson is now back, Michelle. I saw a tech panel suggesting that he might be. I would like to hear from him if at all possible.
All right. Not, Lawson, let's try you again, Lawson.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, excellent.
Well, I can say it's wonderful to be here, and that's a great relief. It's not a great moment for crash down, so thank you for your patience. Yeah.
Can I ask you the same question, Lawson? There was a suggestion in the policy memorandum that the bill, if successful, could actually lead pub closures, and that was disputed by the first panel, of course. I just wanted to get your view of that.
Yeah, our view is, pubs, the least intensive pub sector is one of the operating models that exists out there. Successful and vibrant pubs need motivated operators to come and run them, and they also need investment from people like ourselves at Star Pubs and Bars. You bring those two things together and you create a vibrant pub ecosystem. The other thing as well is this is a partnership model. We are in it together. We let those pubs on a transparent basis. Everyone understands what they're entering into. And I think if you see what's happened with COVID, as Emma and Edith have mentioned, that to me is the ultimate demonstration of partnership. The way we've conceded and offered rent concessions right the way through the crisis. We at Star are now on significantly discounted rents, even though the pubs are now reopened, because we want to see people phasing back to whatever normal looks like and enabling those pubs to survive in the future. If you cut that umbilical cord, our key prognosis is that more pubs will close.
Okay, Willie, are you happy now?
Yeah, thanks for that, Lawson, and thanks, conveners. Thank you.
Okay. In that case, can I go to Andy Whiteman now, please? Andy.
Thank you very much indeed, convener. I'd just like to pick up on a few points that Edith Mumfries was making. First of all, she said that the existing model ensures that tenants as well. Heard in evidence previously that some tenants are earning as little as £10,000 a year. So I wonder if she could clarify that. And secondly, she talks about the fact that we don't make loans. And again, in the previous panel, we heard that some of this investment is in fact in the form of loans from landlords.
Edith.
Certainly, I'm very pleased to respond and clarify that point. We have, I can speak obviously for Hawthorne, and I'm sure Lawson will in due course request to speak on behalf of Star. And we are representing the pub owning companies. So obviously I can't give details about other pub companies, but I certainly can give details about my own. And in terms of the model for our Tide pubs, we would be seeking minimum earnings for our tenants under this model of at least £25,000, and we actually put the numbers within our submission to you to illustrate just the difference between a tied and an untied model. So I dispute the level of profit that was being mentioned in the earlier evidence hearing. It is not the experience of our company. I would agree that that level of earnings is inappropriate and far too low and is not the right level of earnings, and we would not be seeking to perpetuate a relationship where the tenant was getting as little out of it as that. That's in nobody's best interest. That will not create a sustainable business model. That's not what we're about. And I would also say that in terms of looking at, they talked about loans, and I think there was an implication from what they said. They maybe didn't mean it this way, that there was a loan separate to the actual Tide model in terms of the rent, wet rent and dry rent, and that in addition to that, we then in addition to that made separate loans and charged interest on those separate loans. That is simply not the case, and I don't believe that's the case for any pub company. We recoup our investment in a number of ways. Yes, we do often increase the rent, but only in conjunction with going through a detailed business model prior to the investment that we go through with the tenant, so everybody is fully aware and the investment is fully transparent. So the rent will increase often in steps, but everybody will see exactly the journey. It is predicated on increased levels of trade, and it is the increased levels of trade that will give us as the pub owning company some more profit, but it will also give the tenant more profit. There was also much talk about the hugely inflated prices that were between different prices on a keg of beer. That also is not as simple as it would have been purported to be. The pricing, the product mix, the discounts we offer is all to create a sustainable business model with our partners. Yeah, our pubs are at the heart of the community, and indeed they've served the community throughout these throughout the crisis. It doesn't stop at the pub door. It is a community asset, and it is that in which we're investing in for the long-term trade and future of the business. It is in our interest that people make a living income so that they trade with us in partnership. It's also not a joint venture. This is our Tide model. It's not a joint venture model. It is, for the avoidance of doubt, what is purported, if this legislation goes ahead, to be covered by this bill. And it's the lack of certainty that the MRO option introduces that will give us a real problem in terms of our investment, because we won't know, we can't have sufficient line of sight to work with the tenant to see how we can work at earning back our investment, but we earn it back through a combination of the wet and the wet rent and the dry rent, if you like, the pure rent, and it is in collaboration with the tenant, and he benefits or she benefits also.
Okay, thank you. Can I go to Lawson, please? Lawson, you wanted to come in?
Yes, I mean, I think the key point there is just to further clarify, as Edith said, these aren't loans. And, in terms of minimum earnings, this is set in a very transparent way. We do it through a process of setting the rent model where people understand their ingoings, outgoings. Those are jointly agreed, and there's absolute transparency there as to the minimum you should earn out of the pub. But the key, as Edith said, is to grow pubs, make pubs more successful and make them fit not for today, but for the future. And to do that, investment is a key thing. We all know that consumers want different things and they have higher expectations now of that environment. And therefore, pubs need to adapt. And to adapt in that way, we invest. We do it in an open and collaborative way. Otherwise, you wouldn't find motivated operators to come and run them with you. And what that is all about is growing the profit pool of that pub, making that pub more profitable, more sustainable. And then there's absolute visibility of, yes, the rent goes up, but absolutely the profit potential goes up. And that's how the model works. It works in an open and transparent way. And we are out there competing for the best operators. This often gets lost in this debate. We're not forcing people to come and take our pubs, far from it. We want to work with motivated individuals who see the potential for that pub. And that's where the entrepreneurship of this model comes in. And we can recruit brilliant people at the heart of communities and invest with them and create great and sustainable pubs. It's a competitive market for great operators.
Thank you. Andy, did you want to come back in?
Yes, I mean, obviously in any relationship of a landlord and tenant, there is an imbalance of power, and we routinely regulate that relationship by varying degrees in statute across the board. I'm just wondering, I mean, both of you, Edith and Lawson, you talked about this partnership and negotiating, if you're making an investment, what the terms will be and consequences for the rent and all the rest of it. But if the tenant is not actually happy with the outcome of that, they don't have a great deal of leverage, is it not reasonable that there be some access to some form of arbitration or adjudication to ensure that there is a fair settlement reached, and that, in the words of one of the principles of the adjudication in the bill, is that there is a better balance of risk and reward?
Hey, Lawson, do you want to respond to that?
Yes, happy to. I think absolutely you need that balance in the relationship, and I think our view is very clear that in Scotland the voluntary code is there. It works really well. And that's been further enhanced with the setting up of the Scottish Pubs Governing Body, which, yes, is in its early days, and COVID has caused delays to that. But we firmly believe through that voluntary code, the access to information, that is enough. And that will free us from the burden of more bureaucracy, more legislation, and actually allow us to get on and focus about recruiting, working with great operators and investing in our pubs in Scotland.
Okay. Emma, you were looking to come in on some of this. Emma?
No, on your previous question, Andy, the average income is actually 38,000 in Scotland. So that's the average income that you get from the Tide pub model. But on the second question about cases and bringing forward that review, in the 4 years since the creation of the Scottish Pubs Governing Body, there's only one complaint been received in that period of time. And of course, we have peers and PCAS that deal with that rent review and independent pub review, and also the court and arbitration part as well. So they are available, and that is all there. And as Edith mentioned, we repeatedly have made people aware of the pubs code and how they can utilise it if they have any problems.
Okay. Andy, are you happy with that? Andy, are you happy with those answers?
Yes, I have a few other questions, but I'll leave it there. I know time's pressing, and I'll back in at the end of the session. Thank you.
Okay, can I go to Rhoda Grant then, please? Rhoda.
Yeah, thank you. Can I just ask a quick supplementary of Edith Monfries? She talked about Tide pubs having a 2-month rent holiday during the pandemic. Can I ask firstly if that also includes market-only rent tenants and joint venture tenants? And can I also ask what repayment holiday our organisation has had from its own lenders over that period?
Rhoda, thanks for the question. First of all, we don't have any joint venture arrangements, so that is not applicable in this case. In terms of market-only rent, we have a very few pubs on market-only rent in Scotland, and yes, we have given rent support where required. The specific nature of the rent support given in those individual pubs, I can't actually comment on here. Don't have that information in front of me, but I do know we've provided support to all our tenants. In terms of holidays, I think you asked me about holidays in terms of our own banking arrangements, did you? No, that we have not had that in any shape or form. No, we have not.
Okay. Can I then ask the panel about, we've heard that when profit goes up for a Tide pub, so does the rent. So where is the incentive for the tenant to actually build that business when they will lose part of that profit back to the pub co?
And who are you addressing that to, Rhoda?
If I could, to Lawson, please, if that's okay.
Yeah, Lawson.
Thank you. Happy to take that question. Yeah, I'm not sure that was quite clear or positioned as we would see it in the previous session. So the process of taking on the pub, as I said, we enter into a rent setting process, which is we advertise the pub at a certain rent. We then go through a very open process where that is agreed and contractually locked down. The important thing is that rent is then fixed, that the rent does not vary with turnover in the majority of our agreements. Therefore, if you do grow the business, obviously you grow the profitability. That is not the case at all, that you would be disincentivized from growing the business. We want people to exceed the business plan. That is the key driver of the business. If they exceed the business plan, they are performing well, employing people and building a sustainable business. And then obviously the challenge then is we want to retain those people in the pub and agree a sensible renewal with them if that is what they want to do. So the rent is fixed, you grow the turnover, you grow your profits.
Okay, does anybody else want to come in on that?
Sorry, Michelle, could I just come back in? So I misunderstood Lawson before, because he said if the profits increased, then there would be a share in the profits between the pub co and the tenant, i.e. the pub co would take a greater share of those profits in rent. Was that not right?
The stability of the pub is assessed at the start of the letting process. and that's based on, for example, we think the pub's going to take £10,000 a week, and you pro-rata that out with all your costs, and that drives a profit number, and then to an agreed rental number. That is your rent. That is it. It's fixed. And therefore, how you perform, if you perform ahead of that, that's great news. You will be making more profit.
Okay, you happy, Rhoda? Yeah. Okay, can I go to Gordon Mcdonald then, please? Gordon.
Thank you, Convener. I just wanted to ask a question about the amount of tie that you have with your partners. So, a pub sells a whole range of products from wines and spirits, soft drinks, draft beer, bottled beers, alco pops, etc. What proportion of your tenants are fully tied, and how many are partially tied? And what are the types of products that tend to be in the tie? To Lawson or Edith.
Okay, let's go to Lawson.
Yeah, I'm happy to take that one. Yeah, I think it's an interesting view when we often talk about tied pubs and then the reality of how restrictive those supply contracts are. I think if you were to look at our Scottish pubs, 80% of them are free of tie on wines and spirits. And that's in a market where obviously spirits are significantly higher in terms of proportion and their choice. Our core supply contracts will be around beer and cider. So we directly supply those, and then there is flex and opportunity for regional craft and cask ales, either directly through us or via the SEMA scheme, which we talked about in the previous session. Because the important thing is matching the offer up to the pub and how that's going to maximise its opportunity. And for example, we've got a couple of great examples. We've got the pub called A Winking Owl in Aviemore, which is actually let to the Cairngorm Brewery. They obviously have our beer and cider range alongside their beer range, and that works fantastically. And actually, if you were to walk, when we are back to normal, across the road to the Kilderkin, which is near Holyrood, you'll see a huge range of beers there. And that pub, for example, has a free of tie deal on Holyrood ales and free of tie casks. So lots of flex actually within our supply contracts.
Edith?
Edith, are you there? Yeah.
I'm here. Hi. Quite similar to Lawson, actually only 2% of our tied pubs have a full tie, and it's not actually what we would normally do. The vast majority, therefore 98% of our tie is a partial tie on beer only, and their spirits and minerals are free of tie, and their wines, obviously. And it's interesting because the most commonly drunk beer in Scotland is Tennent's, but the second most commonly drunk drink is vodka, and the third is lemonade. So for their vodka and lemonade, they're free of tie. Obviously, for their Tennent's, they would be tied. Again, we do offer the opportunity for the pubs that want it for their product mix, to buy the more sort of craft beers that are available, and they then can choose from a wide range of choice. There's some of our pubs stock Musselburgh Broke. There's also Alchemy Ritual. There's also Orkney Red McGregor. These are all, independent brewers with, interesting products, to give the customer the choice that they wish. So we're responding to customer demands on a pub by pub basis. And every single pub that we have in Scotland, the product mix, what's on the bar, is set in discussion with the tenant to respond to what the customer wants to drink, because at the end of the day, it's the customer that drives the business and drives the profit for us and for the tenants, which is what we want to see. That's what creates a sustainable business.
Emma mentioned earlier on about the size of pub closures, and I noted that since 2001, 20% of pubs in Scotland have closed, and certainly in Edinburgh it's closer to a third. I'm just wondering, how has the size of the pubs and bars changed over the last 20 years in Scotland, and with Hawthorn Leisure, has it increased or decreased the size of your estate?
Business have owned Hawthorn Leisure since 2018. We haven't been operating in Scotland for that length of time, but our estate in Scotland is growing, and we would like to see it grow further. we have plans for growth in Scotland. We think Scotland offers a fantastic opportunity to create and to grow and to develop the community pubs that we love so much, and we want to be able to do that in Scotland. And we've, as a business as a whole, as part of our group, we've invested £97 million in Scotland since 2009. We have local shopping centres and retail parks, as well as our 96 pubs, and we really do want to continue to invest in Scotland. But this legislation in respect of the pubs is putting that at risk, and that saddens us as well as worries us. It's the uncertainty that it brings that is very difficult for a business in terms of planning for the future, particularly so in these difficult times.
Okay. I see Lawson is trying to come in as well. Lawson, do you want to?
Yeah, just to build on that, we are a Scottish-based business. We're a significant employer in Scotland. Our entire back office is based in Edinburgh. We employ around 700 people. We have the Caledonian Brewery as well. And actually our pub numbers have increased in Scotland with the acquisition of Punch in 2017-2018, because like Edith, we see a vibrant future for well-invested local pubs run by local operators right across Scotland. Last year we invested £5 million into our pub estate in Scotland. That's because the opportunities are there, the great entrepreneurs are there, and we want to be creating those local jobs, which well-invested pubs do. But to labour the point is that this legislation, with the uncertainty within that framework, would put that in question. No question about it. But absolutely, we want to continue to grow our business in Scotland.
Okay. Yeah. Emma, is that you waving at me, wanting to come in? Yeah. Okay. If we go to Emma briefly.
Real hand. Waving in there. I just wanted to make the point about the pressures on businesses for closures. We were seeing across the whole of the United Kingdom, 3 pubs closing, 3 or 4 pubs closing every week, and that was pre-crisis. And there was also a lot of policy changes that happened. So we had bans on happy hours, changes in drink driving, looking at the smoking ban and other elements of adding on pensions, and all of these things. We don't dispute the basis of the policy itself, but they all impacted on how you run your hospitality business. And those things haven't gone away. And then we have COVID that impacts on this. And so you have to look at what is necessary to support this sector in this moment. And at this moment in time, there is no need for a statutory code. There is no solutions that it provides on that basis. And there are other priority areas, looking at business rates, looking at taxation, that would help sustain hospitality businesses across Scotland and see that investment, which is going to be absolutely vital to the survivability of businesses going forward, to get cash flow and investment back into the pub sector that will mean that it can really stabilise itself and then go on to growth and job creation.
Thank you. Gordon, are you happy?
Yeah.
Thank you. Right, in that case, can I go to Colin Beattie, please? Colin.
I hear in this discussion is about risk and reward and how that is shared or balanced between the tenant and the pub owning company. But I'm looking at hard facts here, and data shows that between 2010 and 2019, 852 independent pubs closed in Scotland, while 330 tenanted and leased pubs closed. Clearly, there must be wider factors here impacting than simply we're discussing here. I would ask, maybe starting with Emma, what these factors might be, and is it as a result of any particular operating model?
Emma.
Thanks for that, Colin. Well, as I just mentioned in my previous answer, actually, these are the elements that I think we need to really target and focus. They were what was putting the sector under pressure before, and absolutely you will see that now with in the pandemic, and how we recover from it over the next 6 to 12 months is absolutely critical. So this proposal really cannot move on past this stage. This is something that is going to add another level of uncertainty without providing any solutions, and the sector absolutely doesn't need that right now. We need to look at that tax burden that's on them. 11 times more beer duty than we pay in Germany or in Spain. We need to readdress that. We need to invest in our domestic businesses to ensure we have very strong Scottish brewers being here in Scotland, making sure we can make that offer available to our consumers, but making sure that our pubs as the main outlet for that and main route to market are able to actually pass that on. So £1 in every 3 spent in a pub is going to the taxman. And so we need to readdress those issues. We pay disproportionate business rates as pub businesses versus our turnovers. We pay disproportionately more, and that absolutely needs to be addressed. And we've seen a VAT cut to incentivise people to go back to the Scottish pubs, which is very, very welcome. But in the long term, we're going to need to look at also that VAT that comes on there as well. So there are many things that we can do to tackle this problem, to make it more efficient, to run a business and to create jobs. That's ultimately what comes in. And investment is absolutely key, and we cannot put in jeopardy any of that cash flow or any of that investment that needs to go into the sector at this moment in time to sustain those jobs and to then hopefully create more in the future.
But you haven't actually addressed the question of what the actual wider issues are, the wider factors that are driving that disparity between the number of independent pubs closing and the number of tenanted leased pubs.
But I would say in response to that is that because they have that business support, they have people to help them through that and guide that business model. And that is why it's more successful, it's more sustainable, because they share that risk. And they have also, the benefit of their membership of the Scottish Beer and Pub Association, I would say, for our pub-only members. And that is really important to give that advice, to make sure that we have somebody advocating for the sector and making sure that their voice is heard in these debates as it is today. It is enormously important, but that risk is shared in the model, and that's the whole point. And that's why the Thai pub is so successful, and it has been for over 100 years now.
Anyone else like to comment on that? Yeah, silenced them. Then let me ask one other question, just on the back of that. Obviously, we've already got a voluntary code, and if there's an issue with the rent, and rent seems to be a big issue for some, they can seek independent adjudication, and the pub company agrees to be bound by that. Now, how many tenants actually take part in that? And how many tenants actually are found in favour of in terms of this voluntary code?
Right, who wants to come in on that?
Has anyone any of the voluntary code?
Edith, go on then.
Voluntary code and the voluntary. Can you hear it? Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're right now. Go.
Sorry. First of all, can I just come back on the previous question, because I didn't get my request to speak in on time, just because I think there was a feeling that nobody wanted to say any more. I mean, I think the structural issues that may have led to pub closures, and of course the disproportionality between the independents and the L&T models is, first of all, I think we all recognise that we need to reinvigorate our local communities, and I think that is a priority, and I think it will be an even bigger priority as we come out of COVID. I mean, in terms of independence versus the lease and tenanted model, I agree with Emma that it is all about the support and the guidance that we can offer, particularly to our tied tenants under the L&T model that we operate, and we would continue to do so. And I think that then addresses the consumer demand, because it's consumer demand that keeps pubs open. It's reinvigorated local communities that keeps them at the heart of those communities, serving the men and women that live and work there. So I think those are the structural issues that we need to address in our society to reinvigorate the pub sector, and indeed to ensure that it succeeds and thrives in the future, which is what we equally are seeking to do. And then I think the second question, can you just repeat the second question so that I can clarify my answer?
The voluntary code, and I'm trying to get a feel of how often it's used, how successful it is. Obviously, the pub company agrees to be bound by the results, but does this actually answer most of the concerns of tenants who have a problem?
Well, I believe that the answer to the concerns that tenants have should be largely met, before it gets to the point that they'd want to appeal under a code voluntarily or otherwise, whether it was a statutory or a voluntary code. And obviously the voluntary code is communicated very clearly to the tenants. They know that it's there, but in most cases, if you're having a successful relationship, you have no reason to invoke it. And I think that the majority of our tenants, certainly from my experience and from talking to all our tenants and from our 10 tenants that wanted to write into to put their submissions to this panel to say that they opposed the bill and that they felt that the relationship was a positive risk and reward sharing relationship, a partnership, they've no need to invoke the voluntary code. And so, that further underpins the fact that there's no need to go beyond that. It's there if people need it. If they don't need it, then there won't be many appeals to it, because we resolve that long before it gets to that point. We set rents that are sustainable and have a business model that we work on with our tenants to ensure that their businesses are sustainable and future-proof. And in 2016, the Scottish Government's independent report concluded that there was no need for legislation in this area, and I believe that's even more true today.
Okay, I see Lawson and Emma are wanting to come in, so we'll go to Lawson first.
Edith actually summarised that very well. I mean, the answer is that very few go through to the voluntary process. We don't have those exact numbers to hand. I mean, I think we should all commit that we'll get those back, just so people can see the actual scale of it and understand where it is. I mean, but the key point for us is deliberate. It's in our vested interest to agree proactively and avoid this process, which I think is what the headline numbers will show, because they're not big numbers, they're not leap into hand here, and we have an interest in resolving issues and maintaining positive commercial relationships with great operators, because if we haven't got great operators running great pubs, there is no business, and that is the absolute driver of what we're all about.
And Emma, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, no, I did. I mentioned it earlier, actually, in that only one complaint has been brought against the code since 2016. And I think that it's because we have a very good relationship between the pubcos and our tenants, but also because of the Scottish market is very different. It's much smaller, so we see fewer complaints. That's just the reality of the scale of the issue. So there's only 750 Thai pubs in Scotland. And so the percentage of them that would feel that they had a dispute or needed any resolution is also very, very small. And that's why we don't believe we need to have a statutory code in Scotland.
Okay, thank you. Colin, are you?
I'll leave it at that, convener.
Okay, thank you. In that case, can I move to Maurice Golden, please? Maurice.
Thank you, convener. I wanted to ask 3 questions, but I'll do them all at the same time, and they're for anyone on the panel. Firstly, Chris Wright on our earlier panel mentioned that investment decisions were taken on a whim. So I would wonder if you could clarify whether you make decisions to invest in your pub estate without taking any due diligence and without any corporate investment structure, and as was mentioned earlier, on a whim several times. Secondly, Greg Mulholland on the earlier panel made the claim that the pub companies were exploiting tenants and making them pay full rent during the COVID crisis. So I would appreciate any evidence you can bring to bear on that. And thirdly, and more generally, I wonder if you can explain the impact of the COVID crisis on pubs and what support pub companies provided, and if you can, contrast that with those pubs that were free of tie.
Okay, well, Lawson, I see you wanted to come in first, so we'll go to Lawson, please.
Thank you. So to take the questions in turn, I mean, obviously, Star Pubs and Bars is part of Heineken, the global brewer. We are bidding for capital to invest in the UK and invest in Scotland. And you absolutely don't get access to invest 190 million that we have over the last 5 years in pubs if you're doing that on a whim. Nothing could be further from the truth. So we have a very, very structured process that effectively assesses every pub in our estate. We work our way through a proper estates review process. We would have a plan for every pub, and that plan, shows the opportunities, where the investment opportunities are, where it's right to invest, because obviously we're constantly assessing changing demographics, changing consumer needs, and that drives our investment process plan in a 5-year outlook. Okay, and then obviously that then crystallises it down to what we plan in any given year. So as I've said, last year, for example, we invested £5 million in Scotland. We would have been working on that investment in the 2 years. These are really involved, big capital projects, over £250,000, creating massive supply chain jobs in the setup and the delivery of that pub, and then ongoing in the successful delivery of that pub. So I hope that gives there is rigour around that process. In terms of rent in the COVID period, the biggest challenge without doubt the industry's ever faced, to physically close the business is something, let's hope we never ever see it again. I firmly believe that the COVID thing has crystallised the benefits within the Tide pub model. So what we did was we immediately suspended rents as we assessed the situation. We then issued a whole series of significant rent concessions for the closed period. Those were either 50%, 75% or a 90% concession. We have then extended those concessions for the first 2 months of opening. And then last week, we committed to further support for September and October with continued rent concessions as people build their business back up. In Scotland, that's a £2 million plus investment from us in terms of physically supporting pubs. But most importantly, what we're doing there is giving people surety and understanding in this period of massive uncertainty. To reopen a pub in COVID is hugely challenging. That we acknowledge there are increased staff costs and there's increased complexity, and there are just increased onus on you as an operator to focus on delivering that pub. You don't want to be worrying about the rent. We have committed to that basis. And alongside that, we have packaged up all the support, all the interpretation of government guidance. We've made that simple, we've made it accessible, and alongside a plethora of point of sale and how-to guidance, which I think, has enabled significant numbers of our, that's why 90% of our pubs are open and trading in this very challenging period. With, let's be clear, more challenges to come over the next 6 to 12 months as we build trade back.
Thanks.
Thank you. And I see Emma wants to come in, so we'll go to Emma, please.
Very, very briefly, because Lawson said everything really that needs to be said, but just in terms of the instance of somebody being asked to pay full rent, I think that was actually reviewed on a case-by-case basis, and then a universal rent deduction was made across the board on that company-specific instance. So they have received concessions, but many were done on a case-by-case basis to help support that pub and sustain it through COVID. And you'd only have that support, they're able to zone in, understand your business, if you're in a Tide model. That's the kind of support that you get through these moments in time, and they'll have that to see them through. And on the making whims, you don't invest millions, up to 15 million a year that we're investing in Scottish pubs on a whim. And I just wanted to reassure you that it's actually a real business decision that's taken on the certainty of that environment, the quality of that investment, and how we will make sure we get the return on that. That is a business decision that's taken in partnership with our tenants, and that is only going to be done and continued if we can do that in the full knowledge that we'll be able to recoup those costs in the future.
Okay, thank you. And Edith also wanted to come in, so I'll go to Edith.
I just want to, reinforce what Lawson and Emma have said. That clearly, as a responsible company, we would never invest money on a whim. that would be anathema and very, very irresponsible, and we certainly wouldn't be putting our shareholders' money at risk in that way. We take the investment decisions much the way that Lawson has described, working with the tenants, putting together a business model, understanding how it's all going to work, and then obviously monitoring it very closely post-investment to ensure that what we thought would happen, and that is exactly how we would do it. We invested 500,000 in our Scottish pubs in 2019. We had plans pre-COVID to invest another £2 million in 2020. Obviously, we've had to review that in the light of COVID, but most particularly in the light of the shadow of this bill, where the outcome remains uncertain. Clearly, as soon as we have certainty and the shadow of this bill can be lifted, the better it will be for our pubs in Scotland, and we can proceed at pace with the investment that we want to make, create more vibrant pubs within our local communities. I was saddened by the comments of the panel, and much was made about the exploitative nature of the relationship that we purportedly have with our tenants. I have seen no evidence of that. I do not believe that that is the case. I have endless emails from very grateful tenants for the level of support that we have provided, not just through COVID, but throughout our relationship with them. You know, one of the submissions to you was from the Victoria Bar. That John in the Victoria Bar has been working with us for 13 years, and John says we're great to work with. Colette in the Braes has worked in pubs for 30 years. Our tied tenancy was the first one she'd taken. It closed 27 days after it opened because of COVID, and she phoned me in tears the other day and she said, I don't know what we would have done without you. That doesn't sound to me like exploitation, and exploitation doesn't include the rent concessions that we've granted, over £1 million of support that we've provided in rent concessions and other support. We're encouraging breweries to provide free umbrellas and seats and chairs to enhance outdoor space, to allow safe drinking outside, to ameliorate the trade within pubs. We're also ensuring that we are on top of all the guidance we provide so that we can comply with all the latest recommendations to keep our pubs safe, so that our customers can return to enjoy their much-loved pints with their friends in their much-loved pubs. And we want to be able to continue to do this without the dreadful shadow of this legislation. And I really do thank you for your time in listening to us. It's meant an awful lot to us, and I'm sure to all our tenants in our pubs in Scotland.
Thank you. Maurice, did you have anything else you wanted to add?
No, that's fine, thank you.
Okay. I see Willie would like to come back in, so I'll go to Willie Coffey, please. Willie.
Thanks very much, Convener. It was just what Lawson was talking about, delaying the rent payments, I think, during COVID. Lawson, did you mean that rent will be foregone now, or will you be recouping that at some later stage from the tenants?
No, Willie, for absolute clarity, that rent is foregone. Right, so it is cancelled, it is no longer due, and it is no longer payable on the concessions that we've agreed across our pub estate, which amounts to that. It's a range of 50 to 90% discount on their rent, and that's where I get to the £2 million plus number. So absolutely transparent on that.
Okay, thanks very much for that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Just finally, I'd like to ask the members of the panel, obviously in the first session we heard a number of accusations around the relationship not being a good balance of power. And it was said at one point that there is a grocery code in Scotland, so why not a pub code? And there was a feeling that that would give parity within the different sectors. And there was also comments about the reason we didn't hear from tenants sort of complaining. There was a suggestion that there would be concerns about a backlash from the pub codes, that benefits that are individually decided by the cupcos for the tied tenants might be changed or removed, and that if in cases where they had exercised their legal rights to challenge the arrangements, that they would get no support down the line. These are pretty significant accusations, and I just wondered if any of you'd like to comment on them individually. All right, so I've got Lawson, in fact, all three of you. So Lawson, Emma, and then Edith. Lawson.
Comment on them. I think, they are anecdotes. They are not reflective of the business that we operate, and they're not reflective of how pubs and Thai pubs operate in 2020. There are a lot of very distant and historical references there that just aren't based in fact. We spend a huge amount of time surveying, talking to, engaging with our operators right across Scotland. We care how they feel. We care how we are perceived. We want motivated people in a transparent commercial relationship running our pubs. That's what we want. There is no benefit, no commercial benefit whatsoever to seeing pubs close, people fail, and the churn and the costs that comes with that. That is not the business model. It's not a business that I recognise or am part of. Therefore, and then in that context on, do we need, it's in England and Wales, therefore we need it in Scotland. I still think you come back to the Scottish market is fundamentally different. This is 17% of the pubs across Scotland. It's a much smaller proportion. And in addition to that, the voluntary code and all the things we said about the voluntary codes, combined with the Scottish Pubs Governing Body working well, functioning, I think that is the framework under which we need to operate and go forward. And that will lead us all to be remaining committed to investing in a very healthy and successful Scottish pub landscape.
Thank you. So go to Emma then.
Thanks. I think there's a little bit of confusion because the Groceries Code really doesn't have anything to do with rent. And I just want to emphasise about the scale of the marketplace and also the scale of a perceived problem here. So even on your own survey, you had 59 partially responded, 39 fully responded, 37 of those said that they felt they could go forward. That was 7.8% of Tide pubs. So there is, 92% of people that have absolutely no warrant even to respond on this issue, because presumably they are happy with the arrangement that they have. And we're in a situation here where we're trying to support our Scottish pub sector and our beer sector and to make sure that they can survive through this crisis. And we need to focus on what we can do that will impact the majority and not on this very, very small few minority voices that have a perceived problem with the situation. We have the statutory, we have the voluntary code that deals with that. There is a way that they can appeal to the pub governing body in Scotland. They can, with the code, they can go to peers and the PCAS in terms of getting any reviews that they want on that, and that's independent. So there are already mechanisms in place to deal with those, and it is the scale. We're dealing with something very, very different. We've got 39% over 20,000 pubs in Tide in England and Wales, and the reality we only have 750 in Scotland. So I think we need to be focusing on how we can bolster the whole of the sector, what would impact on the whole of the sector, and I've alluded to those issues that I think should be a priority if you're going to be looking at legislation.
So no suggestion then that those who have complained or suggested that there's issues with the organisation, you can say to the committee categorically that there's no backlash, no loss of benefits, no removal of support for those who have complained or given evidence suggesting that this is not the right way and that there should be statutory changes. Edith, I think you were next to speak.
Yes, I mean, I was surprised at a lot that was said this morning. I didn't recognise our business and how we operate in Scotland, in our 96 pubs in Scotland. I didn't recognise that business with the business that was being described this morning at all. So I can categorically say that there is no fear within the relationship with our tenants. It is a collaborative and partnership relationship because that is in both our best interests. I can categorically say that benefits would not be unilaterally withdrawn if somebody said something that we didn't like. That's not the sort of business I run. And I would never run a business like that. Much was made by Tom Steiner of the 2014, I think it was, survey, which actually predated the Scottish Government's independent survey that said there was no need for legislation. I mean, I disagree with Tom. I think the world is a very different place in 2020. And I think it's been 6 years of pub businesses recognising the importance of good relationships with tenants, that actually that is what drives the best future for our mutual business interests. And certainly from all the evidence I have of going out and about in my pubs is that, you know, people are supportive, happy and comfortable. And if there's an issue, they bring it to our attention. They have plenty of opportunity when I pop into pubs, or my CEO, Mark Davis, pops into pubs, say, look, we're not very happy with our BDM, or we don't think we're getting a fair deal. We actually go in and ask them those questions. That's why we go out in our estate all the time in Scotland. You know, the panel this morning, you know, none of them gave very many specific examples. You know, we can give specific examples, so can Lawson, because we're living and breathing our Scottish businesses every single day and supporting them every step of the way. We want to continue to be able to do so.
Okay, thank you very much, Edith. Now, I'm going to go to Andy Whiteman, but I will just let members know that we are letting this panel run just slightly because we've been trying to get the Minister back so that we can move to the next one. But Andy, you're going to get the last question today. Andy.
Thank you very much, Convener. I just want to pick up on some of the evidence of the Scottish Beer and Pub Association, particularly this claim that £10 million of planned investment has been paused since this bill was introduced. So first of all, not in this oral session, perhaps by written follow-up, can you give us more clarity about exactly the nature of that 10 million, what it was for, and when it was due to be invested? And secondly, we've heard from Lawson that in the last year, his company's invested 5 million, so presumably there's been no pause on behalf of our pubs and bars. And we've also heard from Scottish Beer and Pub Association that they've invested an average over £70,000 per pub in the last 2 years. So is this 10 million real? And are the figures of 5 million and 70,000, those are all figures, are they, that predate the introduction of this bill?
Right, who'd like to go first? Go on, Emma, you're waving your hand at me.
Yeah, I've got something popped up on my screen blocking my my chat. In terms of that investment, it is really, really key that we get this right. These investments, I'll give you some examples of what they could go into. They could go into a pub that doesn't have a kitchen to make a food offer. So it upgrades that kitchen. We put in that and that lifts their offer to their consumers, lifts their profitability and increases their offer. That is something we could do. It could be a complete refit of a whole premise, which could go into the hundreds of thousands, as I've mentioned, and I'm just actually off to go and see one now this afternoon, the Speightstown Inn, and the investment that's going to be made there in the tune of 400,000. That would be an upfront complete renovation of a project that's going on. It could be anything that even ranges into making sure that our pubs are compliant with regulation and making sure that they keep up to date with that kind of maintenance to make sure that they can not only be compliant in terms of the regulation, but they can be competitive and that they have a good offer to put out there to their customers. Is enormously important. But we can certainly, by written response to the committee, detail where that money's come from. But you've already heard from Edith of the 2 million that Hawthorn were going to be putting in, that they know that they've now got on hold. So there are figures out there that would substantiate this, and that's why we've alluded to that within our submission. Can I just make one final point in case it's the last time I get to speak? There are 57,000 jobs that are dependent on the pub sector in Scotland. These are people's livelihoods. We need to be very aware that anything you do that impacts on the pub sector that may put those jobs at risk. And I'm just saying that the main thing that we will need to focus on in the next 6 to 9 months is anything that touches on that business model, that hampers it, that burdens it, that slows it down. We need to get cash flow and investment into the pub sector to make sure we can survive through this crisis. The biggest one to hit the industry in its existence. So we really now need to focus on that and those things that will see these businesses through, retain those 57,000 jobs here in Scotland, but also those 4,200 pubs. We want to see them alive and thriving in their communities and able to really be the beating heart in the towns and city centres and villages all across this country.
Thank you, Emma. That was heartfelt. Edith, do you want to have a final comment and a response to Andy's question, and then I'll go to Lawson?
Yeah, I think, Andy, you were asking, how specific is the investment that's actually on hold? The £2 million isn't just a sort of figure that we picked out of the air, and certainly not a figure that we might have arrived at on a whim. It's very much been pulled from the detailed work that we do on our estates review, which is on a pub-by-pub basis. And quite a large number of those projects would actually have been costed, ready to go. And clearly we cannot enter into investments when we don't have certainty of outcome and a risk that at any time, there may be no line of sight ahead because of the shadow of this bill, or indeed the implementation of this bill if it were to go ahead. That's why we're so keen to see this quashed at the earliest opportunity to enable us to get on with that investment in Scotland, which our pubs so badly need and our partners are so much looking forward to. I mean, where we've invested, it's gone so well, £100,000 into the commercial in Dunfermline just before lockdown in February, and they've opened and they're absolutely buzzing, which is fantastic. They've signed up to the Eat Out to Help Out campaign. They've got their cask beers back on tap, and their customers have come back in droves. We want to see that in every single pub in Scotland that we're responsible for, and we believe that bringing in the legislation will put a complete end to that sort of vibrant recovery that we are currently witnessing in the wake of COVID and the easing of the restrictions. So we wish to continue to do that and continue to invest in Scotland.
Thank you, Edith. And finally to Lawson.
Thank you. I mean, to the question, the £5 million was our investment in pubs in 2019. We are absolutely, of course, an honourable company. And as I discussed through the estates review process, these things take time, and therefore it's absolutely about us honouring the commitments that we made in 2019 and in the first part of 2020. But we now need to be, very clear that, as we've said, the shadow of this bill will force us to pause and reflect on investing in Scotland. It poses too much uncertainty, too much ambiguity, and removes the framework from which is to invest in the long term. And therefore, we would urge that we park it sees no more daylight, and therefore then we need to really, really focus on working with pubs, investing in pubs, and getting the right support for all our pubs right across Scotland in what is going to be a very challenging 12 to 18 months. And if we get that right, there's a fantastic and vibrant future for pubs in Scotland. We see it, we want to invest in them, we want to create local jobs, but we need to do that within the surety of the framework, and I would argue the framework in which we currently operate is the right one and it's fit for purpose.
Thank you very much, Lawson. That brings us to the end of this evidence session. So I want to thank Lawson, Emma and Edith for taking part in this meeting. And to all our witnesses this morning, if there's anything that's come out of this, if you want to follow up anything, you can write to the committee, please, and we obviously will take it into account. But I think that's been a very useful session, and I want to thank you. Now, we have been having a few problems with connection to the Minister, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause the meeting. We're going to suspend for a couple of minutes while we just check the connections and see if we're able to continue. So if I can ask us to suspend now, please. Welcome back, and I'm pleased to welcome our final panel for the Tide Pubs Scotland Bill session. And I'd like to welcome Jamie Hepburn, Minister for Business, Fair Work and Skills, Aileen Beerhop, the Head of Good Food Nation Public and Third Sector Team, and Dr. George Burgess, the Deputy Director, Food and Drink for the Scottish Government. Now, we have had some connection problems this morning with the Minister, so it may be that we turn off his video if need be, but hopefully we will get through this session. So I'm going to invite the Minister to make a short opening speech. Mr. Hepburn.
Convener, as I said to you a few moments ago, turning the video off might have a multitude of advantages as far as I am concerned. But thank you for inviting me to speak with you on Mr. Bibby's bill. As you've said, there's been some problems with connection in the last session, so hopefully that doesn't prevail in this session. The Scottish Government commercial agreements, we are keen to see this.
No, we are having problems with your sound, Mr. Hepburn. So I think broadcasting, can we turn his video off and just go with the sound?
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Go ahead. Well, we could hear you. Try again. I think we may have lost him. Broadcasting, could you just confirm, have we lost the Minister?
I can hear you, Convener.
Ah, right, you're back.
And you can maybe hear me but not see me now. I do apologise. I think it's connected. Can you hear me?
No, you're coming and going. I'm not sure. Unless we can improve this, I don't think it's going to work. Take some IT advice.
I'm not sure.
Right. No, I don't think we have any sound at all now. Oh.
I am.
Yeah. What we're getting is a breakup of your voice, Minister.
Fortunately, I cannot hear you now, Convener.
Right.
I think, sorry, Convener, it's Marie McHugh from BIT here. I've been on the phone to Jamie and we've established his network again, but it just keeps dropping out. I don't think there's anything that we can do from a technical point of view.
Right, okay. I think under the circumstances it's going to be extremely difficult to take evidence from the Minister today. So I would suggest at this point, unless the Minister feels otherwise, if he can hear me, I can respond. I think we're probably going to have to delay this evidence session. I'm just looking for confirmation. Yeah. Okay, I think what we'll do is we will end the evidence sessions here this morning. My apologies to Dr. Burgess and to Aileen Beerhop, but obviously without a clear line to the Minister, this really isn't going to work. So we will look to reschedule the session with the Minister, and that therefore ends our public session today and our evidence taking. I'll thank everybody for taking part, and we will, as previously agreed at the beginning of this meeting, we will now move into private session. So thank you very much, everybody, for taking part and watching.